Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was in Fate/Stay Night. Ilya had wanted to summon the greatest of the Greek heroes for the fifth Heavensfeel. Instead she got a berserker who retained his mind and calls her Ilyaheim. What kind of change can Naruto bring to Fate under the berserker class? Welcome aboard! Chapter 6, Second Night. It was rather quiet in the city as Berserker and Ilya made their way at a leisurely pace toward the school. It had been rather interesting as only a few hours ago it had still been a bustling metropolis, but as soon as the sun had set, the side of the bridge that they were based on had become something of a ghost town. Berserker was looking around trying to see if he could catch a glimpse of any sort of threat that might come out of the night. Even though he was confident in his abilities, it would do well to remain vigilant, even as they were merely walking towards the school. He knew that people were most vulnerable when they traveled, and assassin hadn't shown themselves yet. Ilya seemed content to keep on walking at the sedate pace she was setting. It seemed that she was beginning to trust him a little more, and he didn't want to lose the tentative partnership that they had now formed. She was still full of hate, but by the end of this Grail War, Berserker intended to have changed that. They finally approached the school and Berserker could only grin as his little master marched right up to the front gate and then right through. The school really needed some better security. Then again, the people in charge of that probably weren't expecting magi and heroes from days long past to be constantly infiltrating their school. As soon as Berserker crossed the threshold of the school, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It appeared that whatever was wrong here was unnatural. Berserker immediately glanced around, but saw no immediate threat to either him or his master. All seemed fairly quiet within the school grounds. However, Ilya was looking intently at something on one of the walls of the buildings. She quietly gestured for him to walk over. Cautiously, Berserker approached his master's position and looked at what had caught her attention. "What do you make of this, Berserker?" Berserker observed the strange design and thought that it might be some type of fuinjutsu. He studied the seal for a moment before deciding that it was indeed a type of fuinjutsu, although it was one that he had never seen before. It was fairly similar to the one that his clone had found when he was scouting through the area beforehand. "I'm not entirely sure what it is, Ilyaheim, but I'd bet a decent amount of money that it's a type of magecraft." Ilya rolled her eyes at his response. "Of course, it's a magecraft. I already knew that. I was asking if you recognized what type of magecraft it was." Berserker glanced at the seal again, but he couldn't make heads or tails of what the damn thing might represent. However, he did have an idea on how he might be able to find out. "Well, let's see what happens when we do this." With that said, Berserker flipped a kunai into his hand and proceeded to scratch the seal off. "That's one down, but I have a feeling there might be more. How about a game of hide and seek, Ilyaheim?" Ilya shook her head in exasperation at her servant's impulsiveness. "And just who are we going to be seeking?" Berserker gave his fox-like grin in response to her question. "Why, whoever it was that set this up. It seems pretty elaborate, and I bet we'll be able to find more marks like the one from before. Let's see what we draw out after we destroy the majority of them." His master paused to think about his suggestion, but eventually she nodded her consent. "I suppose it will be something to do. Let's see just how many of these are set up. We'll probably mess up the plans of whoever set these up as well." Berserker nodded and then placed his hands in a hand seal. Instantly another 20 copies appeared. He then turned to address his newly made clones. "We need to find as many of these weird seals as possible and destroy them. Let's find out just who is trying to mess with the school." His clones saluted and then blurred into action. With 20 clones it would be a cinch to find and destroy all the other seals. As he turned back toward his master, he found himself frowning. It seemed that there was another servant residing up near the temple that was on the hill. His clone had been moving towards the place when it had been taken out from behind. Shaking his head to get rid of the memories, he once more turned his attention to Ilya, who was looking at him rather oddly. "I didn't realize you could make so many clones at once. Are they all capable of independent thought and movement?" Berserker grinned at his master's question. "Yeah, they are, and this isn't even as many as I can make. Now then, shall we begin to hunt for a few of these things ourselves?" Ilya nodded as she turned from her servant and picking a random direction to walk in. Berserker followed dutifully behind his master, still keeping an eye on the surrounding area. He felt as if he was being observed, and he had learned to trust those instincts. It had saved his life on more than one occasion. Glancing around once more, Berserker could find nothing that should have triggered that kind of reaction. He supposed he would just have to stay on guard as they searched for the seals. Castor was quietly making his way through the streets of the city. His Sharingan had been activated a while ago as he felt himself go into high alert. He had merely been on his way to look at the Matu's establishment and had decided to walk through the park as a shortcut. However, as soon as he entered the area, something about the place had made him feel uneasy. He carefully regarded the moon as he slowed to a stop. It seemed that he was not the only person out for a nighttime stroll. It's rather bad manners not to give your name before trying to kill someone. Castor's eyes zeroed in on a tree and observed a fair amount of prana as the archer from last night materialized before him. Castor felt his eyes narrow as the servant seemed to be sizing him up. Well now, I wasn't expecting the Castor to be out for an evening stroll when I headed out tonight. Castor merely stayed silent at Archer's goading tone. It seemed that the man might be fishing for information. If that was the case, then Castor would play along for the time being. I've always found that evenings are a calm time period. It has so many shadows that begin to creep forth after the long day. Archer smirked in amusement at Castor's comment. So, you prefer the shadows then? Castor gazed at Archer before he answered. Of course, they flicker and fade and you aren't ever sure what lurks in them. The perfect place for someone like me. Archer crossed his arms as he hopped down from the tree he had been occupying. An interesting thought. Though I must tell you, your illusions. Archer suddenly whirled around and blocked an incoming blow from a kunai with a traced sword. Castor seemed utterly calm as the illusion of himself flickered and faded away. He grunted as he received a vicious kick from Archer. I'm starting to get the hang of them. Castor merely remained silent as his tomo spun threateningly in his eyes. Berserker was becoming rather bored as they continued to dismantle whatever it was that was trying to be set up in the school. His clones had swept through the school quickly and he was pretty sure that they had gotten the majority of the seals. He and Ilya were now walking towards the gym and she seemed to be humming merrily to herself as they walked. He supposed that whoever had been setting those seals would be revealing themselves soon. He hoped it would be before they had scoured the entire school. He was getting rather bored just scratching off the seals. Berserker, do you have any idea why no one has arrived yet? Berserker could only shrug as they continued on towards the gym. No idea, maybe they're scared? Suddenly the feeling of being watched returned and Berserker was instantly on alert. He then heard a faint rush of air and dove forward, tackling Ilya and rolling with her before she could understand what was happening. He heard her startled yelp, but ignored it as he observed a rather odd weapon smash into the place that they had just been standing only a few seconds ago. Finally, someone had shown up. Berserker carefully placed Ilya on her feet as he stood up and observed someone approaching from the shadows. He felt his eyebrows rise as he took in their appearance as they stepped out of the shadows. It was a woman that had just attacked him and he took a moment to admire what a fine specimen of the female species she was. Long flowing purple hair adorned a pale face that had some sort of visor on her eyes. She was wearing thigh-high black boots that stopped just before her black skirt. She was also wearing some sort of black arm warmers and a purple color that finished off the ensemble. Berserker gave her an appreciative whistle. Now why would someone as cute as you try to skewer me with a dash? Berserker glanced once more at the weapon and he couldn't help but think it was a bit odd. Nail? Her weapon of choice seemed to be some sort of nail-like dagger that had a chain attached to it. The chain led to the person who had just come out from the shadows. Berserker cracked his neck as he got into a loose fighting stance. Whoever this chick was, he was pretty sure she was a servant. He sized her up for a moment before speaking to his master. Orders, Ilyaheim? He then glanced over at his master who was also sizing the newcomer up. I think we just found our culprit. Eliminate her, Berserker. Berserker grinned as two kunai fell into his hands and he raised them into his stance. With pleasure, Ilyaheim. With it he sprang forward hoping to catch the servant off guard and slashed at her neck. He was somewhat surprised as she bent backwards and kicked him in his floating ribs, making him wheeze out a breath of air before he was blasted backwards from the force. He quickly flipped and landed on a building wall, using that to spring forth to try and attack her once more. This time he shifted his weight a bit and flipped, attempting to land an axe kick. The servant twitched her wrist and Berserker saw the nail now flying at him point first. He blocked it with a kunai and twisted to throw his other kunai at her. She nimbly leapt back as the chain from her weapon coiled like a snake and ricocheted the kunai harmlessly away from her. Berserker then let himself land before backflipping over the nail. He landed a few feet away from the flexible servant and sighed in annoyance. Well, this chick was going to be annoying. That's an interesting way of fighting you've got there, is countering all you can do? He somewhat regretted his taunt the second it left his mouth as she appeared in a blur right in front of him. He barely had time to get his kunai up and block before he was once more sent flying, this time by a blow from her nail chain thing. He smashed into the wall that he had sprung from before and felt it crack. Groaning, he dropped back to the ground. God damn, that was fast. He then sprung forward and blocked another attack from her dagger. The two servants traded a series of blows before Berserker threw a kick, which she countered by raising a knee so that he couldn't get a clean hit. She then pushed herself against his leg and spun so that she landed a spinning kick to the side of his head that sent him flying again. Son of a bitch, he was getting tired of that. She was flexible and fast enough to cause some annoying-ass damage. It looked like he would have to use Sage Mode once more to help him in defeating his foe. He then flipped out of the way as the dagger smashed into the ground that he was recuperating on. God damn it, give me a minute to think. This is supposed to be back and forth. She ignored his statement and proceeded to fly at him with another kick. You know what? Fuck it. He was going to let a bit of his control slip. He let his rage come through just a little bit and the school was instantly filled with a monstrous killing intent as some of his tenant bled through. He then proceeded to smack the girl with a straight punch and sent her flying for a change. He sighed as he let go of that prana. Even using that much was dangerous, he had felt the madness attempting to lure him in. Looked like that would have to be his ultimate trump card. He supposed that that's what noble phantasms were for in the first place. He just hoped Fuyuki would still be standing if he was ever forced to use his. He glanced over to his master and noticed that she looked a little like a deer caught in the headlights. He smiled encouragingly at his little master as he noticed she was shaking a bit. Don't tell me you forgot what my class entails. That was just a taste of what's hidden beneath my sunny disposition. Ilya seemed to shake herself and nodded her acceptance at his reasoning. She then peered into the darkness and Berserker frowned. He had thought that the servant would have gotten up by now. Looking in the direction he had sent her flying, he realized that she had disappeared somewhere. Sighing, he turned back to Ilya. It seems that she was able to elude us for the time being. Ilya merely shook her head in frustration. After all that work, she gets away. Why didn't you just do what you did in the first place? Berserker gave Ilya a dry look. I rather enjoy being in my right mind. The more I use that power, the closer to a normal berserker I become. Ilya seemed to think his answer over for a moment before she nodded her acceptance of his reasoning. In any case, the night is still young. Perhaps we'll run into someone interesting later on. Let's go, Berserker. Berserker gave his standard half bow. As you wish, Ilioheim. The two then began to walk away from the school. They had found what they wanted there, perhaps others would follow during this night. The clash of metal on metal rang out in the abandoned park. Archer was trying his damnedest to get a clean hit on Castor, but the bastard's eyes saw everything before Archer did it. He deftly tilted his head to avoid another thrown kunai and just to spite the man, traced a kunai of his own and chucked it at Castor. Castor didn't seem surprised by this and merely spun around Archer's kunai and Archer himself before attempting to drive another kunai to the back of Archer's neck. Archer merely fell forward and did a handspring to recover. The two briefly stopped their fight as they once more sized each other up. I gotta say, you're pretty annoying even without the illusions. Castor remained silent as he observed Archer before he inclined his head as an acceptance of a compliment. You are adequate with a sword. Archer snorted at that. He liked to think he was a bit more than just adequate with swords. Archer's eyebrows then rose as Castor closed his eyes and prana began emanating from him. I hadn't wanted to use this quite yet, but it seems that I'll have to, against you. Archer tensed as he felt the sickening feeling of death descend over the park that had nothing to do with the corrupted grail that had once been there. That was a hell of a killing intent that Castor was giving off. Maybe he should stop the guy? Just before he was about to attack, the prana and killing intent disappeared. Castor opened his eyes and looked over to Archer's left. Archer felt a bit curious at the 180 that Castor had just done, but his curiosity was sated fairly quickly. God damn it. Why do I have to keep running into you?
Archer glanced to his left and saw that Berserker and Ilya were making their way over towards the fighting servants.
Hey, Itachi, you know anything about a servant with long purple hair? Archer watched as Castor narrowed his eyes in contemplation.
Even if I did, why would I tell you? We are technically enemies this time around, Naruto-kun.
Berserker rubbed his neck a bit sheepishly. Well, I think you're investigating something before you decide to kill all of us. What that is I have no idea, but before you find out I think you'll be holding back a bit.
Castor merely continued to gaze at Berserker. So his name was Naruto? Who the hell was Naruto? For that matter, who the hell was Itachi?
At least it sounded as if the writer of this war was still the same.
He almost sighed in relief.
I do not know the servant you spoke of, Naruto-kun. Archer almost did a double take as the stoic Castor answered. Damn, guess that means I just fought Ryder since you know who Assassin is and I've fought everyone else.
Castor inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement.
An interesting deduction, Naruto-kun. I look forward to seeing what you do with this second chance at life. With that, Castor dissolved into a flock of crows, much to Archer's surprise. If the look on Berserker's face was anything to go by, he hadn't been expecting that either.
Sometimes I really hate that guy. Archer found himself agreeing with Berserker's sentiment.
Berserker then seemed to realize that he was there as well. Yo, Archer.
Been a while, like 3 hours, right?
Archer smirked as he finally exited his stance and dismissed his blades when he was sure that Castor wasn't going to be showing up again.
Nice to see you too, Berserker, or should I call you Naruto-kun?
Berserker seemed to shudder at that.
Not call me Berserker, hearing you call me Naruto-kun just seems weird. If you really have to call me by my true name, just Naruto will be fine.
Archer crossed his arms in amusement at his fellow servant.
Oh? And I thought we were becoming friends.
Berserker shrugged as Ilya watched on in puzzlement. It was then that Berserker seemed to realize something.
Oh yeah, don't know if you formally met.
Ilyaheim, Archer.
Archer, Ilyaheim.
Archer watched on in amusement as Ilya's cheeks seemed to redden from Berserker's nickname for her. She seemed to just roll with it and dipped into a curtsy. A pleasure to meet you.
I am Ilyasviel von Einsburn.
Archer smirked as he gave a half-hearted wave. The pleasure's all mine, Ilyaheim. He continued to watch on in amusement as Ilya froze and then slowly turned to her servant.
Now you have other people calling me that. If Archer didn't know any better, he would say that Ilya had a bit of whine in her voice.
However, he believed it was time for him to take his leave. The comedy act would have to wait. He had something rather important to do now that Castor was gone.
As much as I'd love to stay and watch this, I've got things to do.
Archer then turned to go, but was stopped by Ilya's cry of wait. Curious, he turned his attention to the Einsburn, raising an eyebrow in question.
I think I'm going to take you out of the competition.
Berserker, get him. Archer felt his other eyebrow rise as he looked over to Berserker, who was casually picking his ear with his pinky. Nah, I don't feel like fighting him right now. Besides, I kind of like him. Archer watched on as Ilya gaped at her servant, but decided to take the matter out of her hands, lest she decided to try to use a command spell on her servant. With that thought in mind, Archer astralized and began making his way towards the temple.
There would be some interesting things happening there tonight.
He was sure of that. Castor was once more making his way towards his destination. The battle with Archer had been enlightening. He had studied the man's moves and would be able to hold him off if he needed to now. He had also been able to refrain from using one of his trump cards. The moon was steadily rising in the sky as Castor once more prowled the streets. Castor gazed up at it, savoring the brief peace he was enjoying. That peace was shattered by a yell. What do you mean you failed to stop them from destroying your fort, you piece of shit? Castor felt his eyes pan down to take in a scene that somewhat annoyed him. A young blue-haired student that was wearing the same uniform as the one from last night was kicking a woman who was on the ground. At their feet lay another body. Castor could tell from this distance that the body was dead. Well, it seemed that he had run into something that might be related to the war. I'd appreciate it if you stopped doing that. The blue-haired student stopped kicking the woman and looked over in Castor's direction.
Ha? Who the fuck are you?
Castor sighed as he turned his Sharingan onto the youth, only to be blocked by the woman.
What the hell are you doing?
The woman merely regarded him coolly, and Castor realized that she had some sort of visor blocking her eyes. He has some sort of mystic eyes. Let me handle him, master. Castor watched on as the youth seemed to think about it before he nodded his consent. Whatever, kill that bastard, Ryder. Castor sighed as the now-named Ryder blasted forward. She was fast, but she was still within the limits of his perception. He spun around her opening kick and lashed out with one of his own. His eyebrows rose slightly as she immediately found a center of balance and blocked his kick with a raised knee. She then proceeded to lash out with her slightly unusual weapon.
A nail connected to some sort of metal chain?
However, Castor was already moving as he ducked under the blade and shot forward. He threw a few punches, but Ryder apparently had decent flexibility as she weaved in and out of his attacks. She then lashed out with a knee towards his groin, but he was able to block that. Even though the move was blocked, Castor was blown back by the blow. So, flexible, fast, strong, and that visor meant that his genjutsu was out.
What an annoying opponent. Castor righted himself by backflipping and landing lightly on his feet.
You seem like a fairly decent fighter. Tell me, why are you following your master's orders? Ryder cocked her head to the side as if puzzled by Castor's query. That's how the war works. We need to follow them so that we can obtain the Grail. Castor narrowed his eyes at her statement. There was more to the story than that. He supposed that he would have to get it at a later date. He had almost been forced to use his noble phantasm already tonight. He would find some other time to engage the servant.
The next time it would be on his terms. Perhaps you merely need to find a different reality for your master.
With those cryptic words, Castor disappeared into a flock of crows, leaving behind Ryder and her blue-haired master. They would meet Castor again. He hated leaving mysteries unsolved. Ilya was once more humming to herself as she and Berserker continued to make their way around the city. True, Berserker had been a bit embarrassing tonight, but she found that she couldn't bring herself to be too annoyed with her servant. He was rather independent, but he seemed to be loyal to her, even if he would refuse a direct order. She paused as she looked at the rising moon. She had been expecting this war to be easy once she had summoned Heracles, but instead she got someone who called her Iliaheim and would refuse her orders at times. Even with his weird character, it seemed like he did care for her. She had found herself drawn to the conversation that they had had earlier today. He had understood her and told her to let go of her hate, but it wasn't that easy.
Her parents had promised that they would return.
Instead, one had died, while the other had adopted another son and left her to rot with the Einsburns. She felt her blood boil just thinking of him, but she forced it down. Hopefully they would run into him tonight, but if not, well, the war was only just beginning. There would be time to take her vengeance later, on her terms. She glanced over to her servant that was walking faithfully beside her and had paused when she did an inquisitive look on his face.
Is something the matter, Iliaheim?
She shook her head as she continued their meandering.
Not at the moment.
It seems that we keep running into servants just walking around tonight.
I wonder who we'll run into next.
A voice suddenly cut through the night.
Funny you should mention that, Oju-chan.
Ilya was brought down to earth and found a man dressed in blue, leaning casually on a red lance, obstructing their path. He was sporting a vicious grin as he gazed at her servant. Berserker, on the other hand, was gazing right back at the man, a sly smirk gracing his own features. Judging from his spear, Ilya was going to go out on a limb and say that this was Lancer. This time she got to see him in person. Lancer then addressed her servant.
Remember me? Castor was once more walking towards his destination.
He had had quite a few distractions tonight, and he was quite delayed because of it. He had decided that he needed to know what was happening with the Matus, but Archer and Ryder had gotten in his way. It seemed that everyone was out to stall him tonight. Just as he had that stray thought, he stiffened as another person walked into his path. He had to hold in an exasperated sigh. Did everyone just want to get in his way tonight? This newcomer was a man with blonde hair and red eyes. He was also holding himself in a rather regal demeanor. He was dressed in a rather elegant, but plain, white shirt and a set of black pants. Even though he wasn't openly threatening Castor, he gave off the feeling of being very dangerous. So, you're one of the mysterious servants that Kodomine hadn't been able to place? Why didn't you and your master go to the church to let him know of your participation? Castor felt his eyes narrow at that. There was some sort of place that had them state their participation? He hadn't known that. I suppose it's because I like to remain as anonymous as possible. The blonde-haired man's eyes narrowed at Castor's answer. Oh? It seems that you're not one to follow rules blindly. Very well then, Let's see what kind of entertainment you can give me for this war, mongrel. With his piece said, the blond man placed his hands in his pockets and began to walk back in the direction he came. Castor observed him carefully, not moving from his spot until the man was gone. Well, it seemed like he had another mystery to solve. Just who was that man? And who was Kodomine? He supposed he might have to find out where the place to give notice of participation was. He had a feeling that he wouldn't like whatever it was that he might find there. Castor sighed. Perhaps now he could continue on with the original errand that he had decided to accomplish tonight. With that thought, Castor continued on. Saber felt rather angry with her master at the moment. He knew where the enemy was stationed and he had decided not to make a move on them. She gazed around the house as she exited through the front gate. If he would not fight, then she would just have to take care of this servant in the temple herself. She was confident in her abilities to thwart any servant that might be residing upon the hill. True, Castor had caught her off guard, but she was confident that her magic resistance would be a factor when fighting him, and even though Berserker had surprised her with his lucidity and skill, she was confident she could defeat him if their paths crossed again. She needed to have that confidence as she rushed towards the temple. Whichever servant was residing there, they would probably be dangerous, but they also might not be expecting anyone to come and blatantly attack them. Her armor shined in the moonlight as she finally made it to the bottom of the stairs. She began to rush up them, taking two at a time. She would utterly destroy whichever servant was up here for her master. It didn't matter who it was, they would fall before her blade. She had spent years honing her skill and had participated in the war before this. She was prepared for just about anything. As she rapidly approached the torii gate, a soft voice rang out in the night. So, you did come. Saber was startled to a stop as a man seemed to melt out of the shadows beside the gate. The first thing she was drawn to was the headband that he was wearing. Like Berserker and Castor, he had the same type of marking on the metal plate. She then moved her eyes down to his face and took in his features. Startling blue met her own aqua as he calmly gazed down at her. His blonde hair was stirred slightly by a gentle breeze that had begun to pick up. He was wearing some sort of blue uniform beneath a white overcoat that was fluttering along with his hair. She stood, slightly transfixed by this person, and realized that her back had straightened a little just by being in his presence. Itachi-chan is pretty good at figuring out what people are going to do. He predicted your master might not approve of you coming here, but you would want to strike anyway. I suppose that's why he left me here. At seeing what was no doubt a puzzled expression on her face, he gave a little chuckle as he rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. Ah, where are my manners? He then gave her a half bow, never taking his eyes off her. My name is Namikaze Minato, the assassin of this war. Chapter 7, Second Night, End. Saber was instantly put on guard as soon as Assassin introduced himself. This was the first time that a servant had revealed their true name as soon as she came into contact with them, and she couldn't comprehend why he would do so. However, her code of honor would have her respond in kind. It's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Dash. However, before she could complete her introduction, she was interrupted by Assassin once more. Don't worry about introducing yourself, you can just give your class if it makes you more comfortable. I kind of introduced myself on an impulse. Saber was taken aback by the man's somewhat sheepish nature as he was rubbing the back of his neck apologetically. Nodding, she decided to take the generous offer that he had given her. Very well, I am the Saber of this war. You said that someone else predicted my movements tonight and those of my master? Assassin merely smiled gently as he gazed down at Saber. That seems to be a bit of a fishing tactic, but I guess it couldn't hurt to answer. Yes, there was someone who was able to deduce your movements, Saber-chan. Saber flinched at the nickname that the man had given her. She thought that only Berserker would be brazen enough to call her that. Come to think of it, this man looked startlingly similar to Berserker. The same body type with the same blonde hair and blue eyes, though Assassins were of a slightly different shade. Saber cautiously eyed the man, trying to determine if he might be related to Berserker in some way. It seems you have a question, I can see it in your eyes. Go ahead and ask. Saber gathered her thoughts for a moment before she decided to try and see what the man would be willing to divulge. Do you know who Berserker is? The man seemed amused by her query as he nonchalantly crossed his arms and once more leaned against the torii gate. You could say that we've met before, after a fashion. So, he did know Berserker in some shape or form, although it seemed he did not want to divulge exactly how the two had met. However, her eyes widened as she took in his stance and his utter calm.
Are you stalling for time?
She asked this a bit on the incredulous side.
Why would assassin need to stall for time?
However, by the slight frown that then graced his face at her query, she deduced that she was right.
Ah.
I was hoping you wouldn't notice, it's such a nice night out and it seems a shame to spoil it by fighting needlessly. Saber bristled at this comment.
Needlessly.
You were summoned as a servant in the Holy Grail War.
We must fight. That is the only way to obtain our wish.
Assassin merely sighed at Saber's outburst and closed his eyes before he once more pushed himself off the gate.
It seems that you won't be deterred by anything that I say.
I suppose I should have expected as much from the Saber class, but I should warn you. Assassin then moved. Saber could barely keep track as it seemed he almost disappeared, his movements becoming a blur, and she was barely able to get her blade up in time to block his strike. Her eyes locked with his as they held that position for a moment, his white cloak fluttering down after the movement that he just pulled. He was now holding a knife that was similar to the ones that she had seen Berserker and Caster use, with subtle differences. It had 3 blades for one, was slightly longer, and had some sort of runic paper attached to the handle.
I'm pretty fast.
Ilya watched on as the sound of metal crashing against metal echoed throughout the park once more. True, her servant had ignored her order to engage with Archer and she would be having words with him about that later, but she supposed that she would have to be content with Lancer for now. The 2 servants were bathed in moonlight and she could barely catch a glimpse of their weapons at the speed that they were fighting at. She thought that Berserker most likely had the upper hand at the moment, but he seemed frustrated about something.
What's the matter, Blondie? Can't use your fancy spinning ball of prana at the moment or use the technique that boosts your strength and speed?
Lancer's taunt made Berserker's eyes narrow and Ilya watched as he got inside Lancer's guard once more by redirecting the attack and then trying to slash at the man's throat.
However, Lancer proved to be a wily opponent once again as he flowed with the momentum of his blocked spear and aimed a kick at Berserker's back.
Berserker seemed to sense something was wrong and he dove forward into a roll. As he came up he flung one of his kunai at Lancer, but the man merely spun his spear and deflected the attack.
Come on now. You should be better than this, maybe the last few fights were a fluke?
Berserker seemed to take a bit of offense at this.
Oi!
It's kinda hard to pull out my best when we're fighting like this, and I don't really want to use my noble phantasm quite yet. Lancer just shook his head at Berserker's response. Ya dumbass, a fight is supposed to be something that you give your all in, with all the tools at your disposal. I suppose I'll just have to force you to use your noble phantasm. Lancer once more got into a loose stance, but paused as he noticed something. Berserker had gone oddly still for a moment. Suddenly, Berserker exploded from his side of the battlefield and rapidly closed the distance between him and Lancer. Lancer was able to bring his spear up to block as a vicious punch connected. However, the force of the blow sent him flying backwards. Ilya caught a sight of Berserker's eyes and instead of blue he once more had the amphibian-like ones that he had had last night in his fight with Saber. Lancer readjusted himself and landed gracefully on his feet, eyes narrowed in contemplation.
Well. It seems that I was able to bring out at least one of your little tricks again. So how about we see what makes that technique tick?
Lancer brandished his spear, but before he could do anything another Berserker appeared behind him and tried to thrust a kunai into his neck. Ilya blinked as she saw Lancer duck and then smash the shaft of his spear into the second Berserker, only for him to disappear in a shroud of smoke. Then, the original Berserker was there and he was once more holding a glowing ball of prana. You wanted another taste.
Well, here it is, Rasengan.
Berserker thrust his attack forward, but Lancer was prepared for the attack this time as he dodged the prana ball and grabbed Berserker's wrist.
Lancer then grinned maniacally. Hot damn, I knew you would come to me if I just waited it out. Lancer then aimed a thrust at Berserker's exposed chest and to her surprise he connected.
Berserker's eyes widened a bit as he took in the spear that had impaled him, but then he disappeared in another plume of smoke.
That one was also a copy?
Ilya glanced around trying to pinpoint where her servant had gone to, when she began to hear a screeching that seemed to be increasingly growing louder. Lancer must have heard it as well because he whirled around, only to stop in shock. Ilya followed his gaze and felt her mouth drop open at the sight of her servant. Berserker was standing a little way away with an expression of grim determination on his face. His right arm was raised and he had a clone on each side of him, apparently perfecting whatever technique he was preparing.
Sorry, Lancer, but this is game over.
I don't really want another rematch with you. Whatever kind of attack Berserker was preparing was consuming a massive amount of prana and was exorbitantly loud.
Lancer recovered first.
God damn it, I don't think I could take a hit from that and keep on going.
Berserker didn't give Lancer any time to consider his options as he threw the monstrosity that he had been preparing.
Ilya felt herself openly gaping at her servant as she watched the attack sail through the air towards Lancer. However, midway through its flight, it seemed that Lancer had thrown his spear to intercept the attack. Ilya watched as Berserker's eyes widened and then he was in front of her. She was confused as they were suddenly moving and then an explosion lit up the night as Lancer's spear and Berserker's attack connected.
Ilya felt the shockwave of the two techniques thump into her and both she and Berserker were sent tumbling away.
It took a moment, but the explosion finally ended, leaving a smoky crater in its wake. Ilya turned her gaze to Berserker and vaguely realized in the back of her mind that her ears were ringing. Berserker was panting, obviously tired from the effort that the technique had taken, and his amphibian-like eyes were once more sky blue.
God damn, that sure wasn't a half-assed attack. Ilya's eyes widened as Lancer stumbled forward into their line of sight.
Despite the fact that he was covered in blood from various wounds, he still sported a manic grin on his face. He was also panting as heavily as Berserker was. To force me to use the other aspect of Gibalg, and as a makeshift defense, you really are no joke. Looks like we might have to cut this short for tonight. Even though it wasn't as strong as it was supposed to be because of having to use it on the fly, my master is still bitchin' about how much prana I just had to use. I don't feel like forcing him to use a command spell on me, so I guess we'll call this one a draw.
Looking forward to next time, Blondie. Lancer nodded his goodbye and then astralized so that Ilya and Berserker were left alone.
Ilya then gazed up at Berserker. What was that? Her voice was fairly quiet, but Berserker still grimaced a bit at her tone. She sounded somewhat dazed from the events that had just transpired. Sorry, Ilyaheim, but I wanted to put him down for good, and that was the best way I could think of doing it. Basically, the attack just now was the completed form of the Rasengan, which you've already seen me use.
Ilya nodded as she accepted Berserker's answer. Was that a noble phantasm?
Berserker only nodded. It's an aspect of one of my noble phantasms. I didn't think anyone could block that attack like that Lancer guy did. I don't want to face something like that if that wasn't even at full power.
Berserker then took in Ilya's state before glancing down at himself.
He sighed as they climbed to their feet. I think we might want to go back home for the time being. I didn't think I would have to use an attack like that tonight, and I need some time to recover. If someone like Itachi comes along right now, I don't know how good I'll be in a fight. Ilya wanted to nod her consent to her servant, but took in the state of the park and sighed. Much as I want to get out of here, I think we need to clean up the mess that we made, otherwise the war might be dragged into the open. Berserker took the time to look around the park as well and had a suitably sheepish look on his face.
Sorry about that, Ilyaheim. Do you think anybody heard our fight?
Ilya merely shook her head in the negative before answering. I highly doubt it. I set up a bounded field before you two began fighting that encourages people to not investigate this area.
Ilya watched on in amusement as Berserker sighed in relief at her statement.
Well, at least there's that. Ilya nodded, but then began to focus on the cleanup process. She sighed as she began to get to work on fixing the crater that the two servants had made. It seemed it might be a bit troublesome to be a master in this war if these were the results that she could expect. Last night had been fairly tame in comparison. Saber was trying her damnedest to get a hit on Assassin, but the problem was that the man was just too damn fast. Every time she thought she had a beat on him, he somehow managed to slip away from her attack and then counter it flawlessly. It was beginning to get a bit annoying. She grunted as she deflected another one of his strange knives that he seemed to be tossing at her, only for it to be replaced by another one. He once more rushed in close and the two traded a few blows once more. The sound of clashing metal echoed throughout the entrance to the temple, and it was all Saber could do to stop him from piercing her with one of his knives. She tilted her head in time to dodge another blade and raised her own sword to parry an attack from Assassin, only to have to shift her sword downward to block a knife that had appeared in his free hand. Grunting, she pushed with all her might and sent Assassin skidding back. However, far from looking as if he was going to be forced on the defensive, it seemed that Assassin was content to be pushed back. He then let loose a chuckle.
I've gotta hand it to you, your skill with the sword is superb. Saber stiffened at Assassin's comment, but tried to play it off. Oh? And how do you know I have a sword? It could be an axe, or some kind of long dagger. Assassin shook his head as if exasperated by her answer. Come now, your movements suggest that you have a sword. I've been carefully gauging your reaction time, letting you get into a false sense of security. I think it's about time we wrap this up. After all, we don't want our silent observer to be let down now, would we? Saber was puzzled at that statement, but she shrugged it off for now. There might be someone's familiar lying within the grounds around the temple or some other explanation for Assassin's cryptic comment. However, before she could really start to wonder about it, Assassin continued. Sorry to say, but this is the end, you've fallen for my trap. Those kunai I've been throwing at you aren't exactly normal. Assassin then flung another kunai at Saber and she was forced to deflect it once more, but she suddenly lost track of Assassin. Eyes widening, she twirled around and blocked Assassin's attack at her blind spot. Only years of battles that had honed her instincts had stopped that blow from connecting. She then watched on in mounting horror as Assassin disappeared in a flash of yellow. She whirled around once more, but wasn't quick enough and received a kick to her chin that lifted her off her feet. However, Assassin wasn't done as she glimpsed another flash of yellow and Assassin appeared above her. His body coiled like a spring before he lashed out with another kick that sent her spiraling to the ground. Saber hit the ground hard and rolled out of the way as another of his kunai embedded itself into the place she had just been seconds ago. Assassin then appeared beside it in another flash of yellow. Saber panted as she tried to catch her breath. This guy was insane. It took all her focus just to be able to even somewhat keep up with him, and it still wasn't enough. She had never thought that she would ever face anyone that frightened her more than Gilgamesh, but this assassin was rapidly climbing the ranks. She also realized, with mounting horror, that he had spread the kunai that were the catalyst for the technique all around their field of battle. She was well and truly boxed in, and she had no idea how she was going to get out of this predicament. He was fast enough that she could barely block his attacks without his flashing technique. With it, he seemed like he might be unbeatable. It looks like you've begun to realize that you're a bit out of your league at the moment. Saber was feeling trapped, and she realized that even if she did decide to use her noble phantasm, Assassin had her surrounded and could kill her before she could unleash it upon him. However, before the two could continue, a voice echoed through the night. Saber! Saber paled as she realized that Shiro had followed her, but hadn't been as fast as her and had only now arrived at the temple. Assassin watched on with something like amusement in his eyes as her master stumbled up the steps and caught sight of the two servants. He was slightly winded from running up those stairs, but when he caught sight of Saber, he gave her an imploring look. Saber! I found you! Saber was about to answer, when Assassin was suddenly by Shiro's side, appearing in a yellow flash of light. Saber reacted as quickly as she could and gave a battle cry, but Assassin then flashed by her side and smashed something into her midriff area. She then went flying into a tree in a rather undignified way and vaguely heard Shiro's scared shout of Saber. Saber shakily got to her feet and was met with a frown as Assassin gazed back at her. Well, it seems Rasengan doesn't really do much to your armor. I suppose I'll have to file that away for another day. Saber grunted as she leant on the tree for support, her sword grasped in her hand. If he was going to cut her down, she would stand defiant to the end. Assassin then surprised her as he ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Well, I suppose that's enough for one night. I don't want to accidentally kill the kid after all. Saber was shocked by these words. He didn't want to kill her master? Before she knew it, she was vocalizing her protest. How can you say that? You were summoned as the servant assassin. Your best tool is to kill the masters from the shadows. Assassin smiled as he snapped a finger and the kunai that had littered their impromptu battlefield disappeared in another flash of yellow. Even if I am assassin, I've still got some moral codes that I don't feel like breaking. Killing someone who was essentially a civilian to me is something that I'd rather not do unless absolutely necessary, and I don't think it's quite come to that point just yet. Assassin then turned his gaze to Shiro. He placed a hand to his chin as he took in her master. You've got a good look in your eyes, kid. I'll leave it there for tonight. We can get back to trying to kill each other some other time. Later. His final piece said, Assassin once more disappeared in a flash of yellow. Saber felt herself marginally relax after a moment. It seemed that he really was gone this time. Sighing, she then turned to her foolish master. I think we should have words, master.
Shiro visibly gulped as he was on the receiving end of Saber's stern stare. Rin currently felt like banging her head against some sort of hard surface somewhere. It was night, and not only did she not know where Amiya had run off to, her own servant had apparently decided to take an unsanctioned vacation day as well.
Was she the only one taking this war seriously?
There were too many crazy factors that just kept popping up. A Lucid Berserker, a caster that could cast illusions strong enough to ensnare the Saber class, an archer that used swords.
What would be next? An assassin that could teleport anywhere in the city?
She snorted at that stray thought. For now, she would have to consolidate her allies and figure out what the hell they were going to do. She sighed as she felt a growing headache as she stood outside Amiya's place. She had thought she had told him to be here when night fell so that they could plan, but he wasn't there when she had arrived, and her servant had decided to take her order to scout out the city as an excuse to go gallivanting around it without her. Just as she was beginning to feel the edges of her patience reached, she heard footsteps approaching. Feeling relief wash over her, she turned to berate whoever it was that was walking towards her, be it Shiro or Archer, when her face paled as she caught sight of the person making their way steadily up the street. The distinct black cloak with red clouds was enough of a giveaway, but the red irises that gleamed in the moonlight didn't do anything to help her fear. It seemed that Castor had found her when she was rather vulnerable. He paused as he made his way up the street and glanced over at her. At the last second, she remembered not to make eye contact and averted her gaze, not wanting to be caught in an illusion.
You are that master from last night.
Castor's soft monotonous voice cut through the night, and Rin did her best to stop an involuntary flinch. She wouldn't show weakness in front of this guy.
Still not looking at him, she decided to answer. Yes, I am. What of it?
Her haughtiness may have seemed a bit forced, but Castor made no comment on it. She chanced to glance at him and was startled to see that he was gazing at the moon. It would do well not to take everything at face value in this war.
Berserker and I are proof enough that something may be wrong. Other than that, I wish you luck in your endeavors.
Rin felt herself gaping at the man as he walked right past her, completely ignoring a helpless master, but before she could do anything to try and cast a spell at his retreating back, he disappeared in a flock of crows.
Well, that was a random encounter. Why didn't he attack her? Tosaka.
Rin turned at the sound of her name and came face to face with Shiro and Saber.
Finally, someone she could vent on. Where the hell were you?
I told you to wait for me and that I would be here by nightfall. I come here and you and Saber are both off somewhere. Rin was going to continue her rant, but stopped short as she caught sight of Saber and Shiro's faces. They looked as though they had just had a narrow brush with death. She pinched the bridge of her nose as she asked the inevitable question.
What happened?
Shiro glanced at Saber, but the servant of the sword remained as stoic as ever. Shiro rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly as he began to explain.
You're not going to like this.
Shiro then proceeded to explain what his encounter with Assassin was like, with Saber adding in additional details every once in a while.
That urge to bang her head against a wall?
It was back in full force. So, you're telling me that the assassin of this war can teleport to places as long as he has some sort of tagged kunai set up? Shiro and Saber shared a glance at her utterly calm tone, but nodded their consent.
Rin smiled.
She felt a little bit of satisfaction as Shiro shivered at her expression.
I think it's time we strategize on how to defeat our opponents.
Castor was once more alone with his thoughts. The encounter with the master from the other night had not been on his agenda, but neither had the other encounters that he had had on this night. It seemed that he was just destined to run into people on his way to his destination. Finally, he came upon the house that he had originally set out to find. However, before he made his way over to the house, he stopped as he got the distinct impression that he was being watched.
I'd appreciate it if you came out now.
From the shadows, a low chuckle was heard before a slightly gravelly voice answered Castor.
Oh? So you were able to sense me?
Well, I suppose that's what happens when I try to hide from a heroic spirit. From the shadows emerged an old man that set Castor on edge. He was wrinkly and thin with a bald head, and the scara of his eyes were black as night. He was wearing robes that billowed over his frail frame, and the only thing that appeared to keep him from falling over was an old wooden walking stick that he was leaning on. Castor observed the man for a moment, before he dipped his chin in a nodded greeting.
You are Makiri Zul'jin, I presume?
The man smiled as if Castor had just told some sort of inside joke.
Now there's a name I haven't heard in a long time, but you'd be wrong. My name is Metuzoken.
Castor narrowed his eyes at this. It seems that you are trying to accomplish something not related to what's going on at the moment. Zoken merely laughed at Castor's accusation, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Castor's neck stand on end. He was then cut off by a series of hacking coughs. It doesn't matter what I'm up to, sadly the only two who could take part in this war are unfit to be a part of it. One is emotionally weak and the other is the same magically. I suggest you not come here again. I still have some tricks for heroic spirits such as yourself. Castor remained silent at Zoken's provocation, but then closed his eyes as if he had come to a realization. I see. Then I suppose I will get no answers from you for now. You aren't even really here. Zoken once more laughed at Castor's accusation. Good guess, boy. I look forward to what you'll bring to this war. With that final statement, Zoken walked back into the shadows, leaving Castor to his thoughts. He had learned a few things despite what he had told the old man. It seemed that this war would become more complicated than he wanted it to be. For now, he would retreat back to the temple and make a plan with Assassin. Archer stood atop the highest tower once more, gazing out over the city. The lights from the various businesses and residences lit up one side, while the other was quiet and calm. He had followed Saber and watched her encounter with Assassin, who was once again a different person, and a rather terrifying one at that. This assassin was also able to go toe-to-toe with Saber, but unlike Sasaki Kojiro in his war, this assassin utterly dominated the fight. He would have to work in conjunction with Saber to even land a hit on the servant, and even then, he wasn't sure of their ability to win. He sighed as he crossed his arms. The servants that had been summoned that he had no knowledge of just weren't fair. They had some way of completely destroying the rules of the war and subverted all of his meticulous plans that would have released him from the will of the world. Those plans were now out the window. He supposed he should be getting back to Rin to make sure she hadn't done anything foolish while he had been gone. His eyes were drawn to a lone figure making their way steadily toward the temple. It seemed that Castor was once more alone and he was in the perfect sniping position. Without a second thought, Archer traced his preferred bow and Hrunting followed soon after. He then formed Hrunting into a thin drill-like arrow and knocked it aiming. He then went through the motions of his archery. Taking a deep breath, Archer aimed the arrow and envisioned its path. He would hit his target, especially with this particular arrow. He then pumped Hrunting full of prana, overloading it so that it became something more than a noble phantasm. It became broken. As he released his breath, he released the arrow as well. He watched in satisfaction as the arrow flew true, reaching speeds that no one could react to, a red streak in the sky. However, his eyes widened as Castor glanced at his flying projectile, but it didn't matter, Hrunting would hit. An explosion tore through the night as his arrow hit home and Archer felt a state of accomplishment. That was one servant out of the way. However, before he could leave, the smoke from his attack cleared and he felt his jaw drop. Castor was unharmed and was surrounded by a flaming something that vaguely resembled a shield. It was gone as quickly as it appeared and Archer grimaced. That was his best shot at catching Castor unawares and taking him out. Sighing to himself, Archer turned and began to retreat back towards Rin. This war just wasn't going his way. Castor felt his muscles relax as he felt that whoever was watching him had left the area. He grimaced as Susanoo deactivated around him. Even just using that much took a toll on his body. He would have to spend the rest of the night recuperating, meaning that he was done for the night. He didn't want to fight any of these heroic spirits without being at his best, just in case. Castor once more began his trek to the temple. Archer had come too close to catching him by surprise. He had been forced to reveal a trump card earlier than he had expected. True, it was only a partial of the true ability, but Archer now knew that he had a shield that could withstand significant force. What a crafty foe. He might become a problem later on, but for now Castor didn't know where Archer had run off to. He sighed, hopefully Assassin and he could figure out their course of action by the end of the day tomorrow. Perhaps it was time to start becoming more active in this war? At the very least, they may need to deal with Archer if he could shoot things like that at them. Ilya and Berserker were tiredly making their way back towards Einsburn Castle. It had taken them a little while to clean up from the encounter with Lancer, and they both were beginning to feel the stress from the battle. They had had enough adventure for the time being. Berserker had recovered some of the prana he had lost from the battles he had engaged in tonight. True, there was no clear winner in either of them, but he had given some pretty good damage and they had interrupted whatever it was that Ryder was setting up at the school, so her and her master's plans were probably delayed. Berserker, we're going to have a talk about following orders. Berserker glanced at his tiny master as she stated this. It seemed she wasn't as forgiving as he thought she was when it came to his refusal to fight Archer. Sorry, Iliaheim, but I just couldn't bring myself to fight that guy for the time being.
He's harmless for the moment.
Ilia sighed as she pinched the bridge of her nose.
It doesn't matter.
He will be a threat eventually, and we don't even know what kind of abilities he has other than the fact that he can project some kind of swords that he likes to fight with.
That can't be his real ability, his very class name suggests otherwise.
Berserker gave Ilia a dry look as he pointed to himself.
Hello?
Lucid Berserker right here. I think the Grail might be messing with you masters. I mean, I'm not entirely sure how Itachi and I got summoned in the first place. Ilia pointed at him as if he had just said something that she wanted to expound on. That's exactly right. If what you told me earlier today is true, your legend might predate the oldest known written story.
It makes no sense. How the hell did I summon you when I was aiming for Heracles?
And how the hell did whoever summoned Castor summon him? Berserker could only shrug at his master's outburst. He had no idea either, but he suspected that Itachi might be trying to figure out what was going on. It was the only reason that Berserker could think of that Itachi left them alive last night.
Whatever is happening, we'll find out in the morning. For now, let's get some rest.
Tomorrow is a new day and all that jazz, so you can finish scolding me then, when we're safe behind closed doors and not in enemy territory. Ilia rolled her eyes at her servant, but her silence was all the consent that Berserker needed to keep on going. They would arrive back at the Einsburn castle soon and their night would come to an end.
Assassin was once more leaning on the torii gate as Castor walked back.
He cracked an eye open and took in Castor's rather disheveled appearance.
Rough night, Itachi-chan?
Castor merely nodded in acknowledgement. Assassin took this as a cue to continue.
Well, I suppose that a servant got the drop on you?
Castor sighed before he responded. I think I may have met every servant in this war tonight except for Saber.
It has been rather interesting, Yandame-sama.
Assassin made a noise of agreement that sounded slightly sympathetic.
I suppose you'll need to rest up then. Has anyone figured it out yet?
Castor shook his head slightly in response to Assassin's query.
As far as I can tell, no one has.
It is the safest way to conduct this war, and they were rather distasteful. Assassin nodded before folding his arms and closing his eyes as he leaned against the gate once more.
And did you place the seal where I told you to put it?
Castor's eyes finally deactivated and Midnight Black gazed at Assassin.
Of course, Yandame-sama, mission accomplished.
Assassin smiled at that.
Well then, rest for now Itachi-chan, you've earned it.
Castor gave a slight bow before continuing on into the temple. Assassin's eyes opened once more as a slight breeze blew by him ruffling his hair and cloak. He stared at the moon for a moment, before giving a soft smile. I'll be seeing you soon, Naruto. The church was quiet as Kodomine strolled through the various pews. He had sent Lancer out for reconnaissance once more and the bastard had gotten into a fight with that blonde servant again. He had even had the gall to consume a massive amount of prana. Gilgamesh had also decided to take a stroll, so he was alone at the moment.
However, it seemed it wouldn't be that way for long.
He sensed someone emerging from the shadows and black keys immediately fell between his knuckles as he caught sight of the visitor. Apparently, he was going to have a rather annoying night.
I must say, you have a fairly nice setup, isn't that right, false priest? Kodomine let his distaste for the visitor show through. What exactly are you doing here and why shouldn't I strike you down right now? Matuzokan merely laughed at Kodomine's threat.
You can try, boy, but I think I might have some information you would want regarding some of the servants of this war. Kodomine thought about the pros and cons of listening to Zokan, but in the end decided to nod his consent.
I'm listening. Chapter 8, Second Day. Ilia once more watched on as her servant did battle.
She was in a forest this time and he was talking to something that made Ilia's hair stand on edge. The killing intent permeating the forest was suffocating as she looked on and saw him talking to a monstrous something. Its bottom half vaguely resembled a human's, but the top half was like nothing Ilia had ever seen before. It looked almost as though it was a tanuki that her father had told her stories about, but made of sand. The demented gleam in its eyes didn't stop the shiver that crept down her back. Her servant was once again a young boy and he was glaring defiantly at the other thing, trying to make it see reason. She could catch snippets of the conversation this time.
Sean.
The monstrous tanuki merely laughed maniacally at her servant's demand.
Come, make, feel, alive.
The thing's piece said it blasted toward her servant, who brought his hands up to form a hand sign that she was beginning to realize meant that he was about to make copies of himself. There was an explosion of smoke and Ilya nearly fell out of the tree that she belatedly realized she was standing on. There had to be hundreds of copies of her servant inside the forest. She then watched on as her servant proceeded to dismantle the monstrous tanuki, eventually getting a hit that made her think that he was either an idiot or a genius, perhaps a bit of both. He had taken some sort of explosive and shoved it onto the tanuki's tailbone. However, it seemed that the half-tanuki wasn't done yet. Ilya watched on in horror as more and more sand collected onto the monster and he grew bigger and bigger. Eventually he was the size of a tall building, towering over the trees. She thought her servant might be done for, but he surprised her as in a gigantic explosion of smoke a toad that rivaled the tanuki in size appeared. The toad was reddish-brown in color and had a tobacco pipe dangling from its lips. Ilya then observed one of the most insane battles that she had ever witnessed, and she had been hanging out with heroic spirits for the past few days. The ground shook as the tanuki and the toad exchanged blows, before the toad was obscured in another giant cloud of smoke and in its place stood a giant fox. Ilya could only gape as the fox then grabbed onto the tanuki. She thought she could see a small figure flit from the fox to the tanuki's head. For a moment nothing happened and then the tanuki cracked and shattered before the fox turned back into a toad. Ilya watched on dumbfounded at the fight of what were surely divine beasts as the toad disappeared in its own puff of smoke, leaving behind its giant tonto. Ilya made her way to where she had seen two small figures fall and saw her servant beseeching a red-haired boy. However, before she could make out what they were saying, she woke up. Ilya blinked as she took in the light filtering from her window. Another dream from the dream cycle? Apparently her servant was partaking in grand battles even before she had summoned him. She sighed as she pressed a hand to her face. These dreams were interesting, but at the moment she just couldn't figure out the significance of them. Yawning, she decided that she had been in bed for long enough and sat up, stretching as she did so. Taking a moment to gather her thoughts, she then called for her servant. Berserker. Although she had said it in a fairly soft tone, Berserker immediately appeared in the light of materialization by her side, already in a half-bowed position. Ilya regarded her servant with fairly cool eyes as she tried to decide the best course of action for his disobedience to her last night. I gave an order I expected to have been followed last night, why didn't you do so? Berserker grimaced at this question before he sighed and ran a hand through his blonde hair, straightening as he did so. Damn, I had hoped you'd slept that particular memory off. Ilya stayed silent at that, merely regarding her servant and waiting for his explanation. She watched on as Berserker sighed in what she thought was an apologetic way. Honestly? I just didn't want to fight that guy when you ordered me to. Even though we're servants on opposing sides of the Holy Grail War, I just can't bring myself to want to fight him the way you would want me to, at least not at the moment. Ilya narrowed her eyes at her servant's statement. Oh? Then why were you so eager to fight Lancer? Berserker rubbed the back of his neck in a bit of sheepishness at that question. Well, truth be told, I actually kind of like him as well, but in a weird we want to kill each other, but if he invited me out for drinks, I'd probably take him up on the offer, kind of way. Ilya blinked at that and gave her servant a puzzled look. So, you're saying that even if someone is trying to kill you, you can turn around and be their friend right away? Berserker gave a soft chuckle at that. Some of my greatest friends had originally been my enemies, some eventually believed in me enough to give their life for me. Berserker's expression morphed into a wistful one as he thought of those friends. Ilya decided to use a bit of the knowledge that she had gained from the dream cycle to test the waters. Even the redhead that you fought as a child? Berserker seemed startled by her question, but then one of his genuine smiles shone through once more, lighting up his face. So you saw my first encounter with Gara this time, huh? Ilya merely crossed her arms and refused to answer her servant, waiting for his answer. Berserker then nodded his acknowledgement to Ilya's query. Gara became one of my closest friends. Ilya was a bit puzzled by this. The fight that she had seen clearly depicted the two trying their damnedest to kill each other. However, before she could voice her thoughts, Berserker was continuing on with his explanation. I also held a great respect for the person that you saw me fight against in your last dream. I built an entire lifestyle on the lessons he taught me. Ilya felt a bit curious at the prospect of learning what her servant had learned and decided to voice her thoughts. And what exactly did you learn? Berserker kept on smiling at her question before he responded.
True strength comes from finding precious people to protect. It served me well for all my life. Ilya felt a bit lost at that. She had had precious people in her life at one point, but they were ripped away from her at a fairly early age. The previous Grail War had seen to that. She closed her eyes in contemplation of her servant's words, but he continued on speaking. You're rapidly becoming one of my precious people as well, Ilyaheim. Her eyes flew open at that, and she looked incredulously at her servant. Apparently he was able to translate her expression, so he let out a low chuckle. Don't be too surprised, we became partners for this war, and you remind me a little of myself when I was younger. Filled with hate. Hate at the circumstances surrounding your upbringing, hate at the way you were treated, hate at feeling so alone in the world. Ilya felt herself cringe as her servant explained his reasoning. She was full of hate. Even that talk yesterday was not enough to smother that hatred that she had kept burning for all those years. She knew that she had felt perhaps a small change in her thought process, but it wasn't enough to let her ease her hatred. Shaking her head to clear her thoughts, she decided to get back to the matter at hand. Be that as it may, you deliberately disobeyed me last night. I'd prefer it if you didn't do that again. Berserker leveled Ilya with a stare that made her feel as if his blue eyes were gazing into her soul. Even if I am a servant who is bound to your will, I'm still a being capable of cognitive thought. I'm summoned under the Berserker class, and that is a blessing in and of itself, but we are more partners than master and servant. I'll fight for you, Ilyaheim, but I'll have input when I feel input is needed. Ilya felt that she understood where her servant was coming from, but she also understood that she had something to supersede any resistance he might have with the power of her command spells. Luckily for him, she wanted to save those for something that might be really important as opposed to her servant merely deciding to ignore her orders on a whim. Ilya shook her head to clear any other stray thoughts and hopped out of her bed, stretching languidly as soon as her feet hit the floor. Her servant had at least performed admirably against Lancer last night. Ilya began mentally going over everything that they had learned about the other servants so far. They had now had contact in some form or other with every servant except for Assassin. Ilya frowned at that thought. Castor had alluded to meeting Assassin, and with his presence concealment he would make for a fairly tricky foe, but she would have to cross that bridge when they came to it. For now she would plan on how to counter the servants that she did know of. Nodding to herself, she glanced at Berserker. I think we'll spend today planning. Occupy yourself while I get ready for the day, but try not to leave the grounds of the Einsburn estate. Berserker nodded once and gave a half bow before he astralized. Ilya sighed as she turned back to the problems that were the other servants. Berserker materialized atop the roof of the Einsburn castle and just enjoyed breathing in the fresh air around the estate. His master was a bit upset with him for disobeying orders, but he thought he had done a fairly decent job of at least placating her for the time being. Berserker took another deep breath before he plopped down on the roof, crossing his legs in the process. Reaching his center of calm, he felt himself enter into sage mode. He reveled in the feel of the technique for a minute before trying to figure out something that had been puzzling him since last night. He knew that he could fire at least 2 Raisin Shurikens before his sage mode was used up, so why had he only been able to use 1 last night? He searched within himself and definitely felt that he could use 2 at the moment, so he had no idea what had triggered his early exit from sage mode last night. Berserker frowned as he concentrated. There. At the edge of his senses there was a brief flicker. It was something that felt tainted, a perversion of nature that had no business being there. If he narrowed his focus even more, he realized that it was coming from the direction of the park in which he had fought last night. Berserker realized that he had been in the heat of battle and had probably missed the strange feeling, but even from this distance he felt as if it was trying to destroy his hold on nature. It was quite minuscule at his current location, but if he were directly in the park, he was sure that it would be much more prevalent. Sighing, Berserker let himself fade back to normal. It seemed that there was another place that was also housing something similar to the park as he had felt it at the edge of his senses. He stretched as he stood up and realized that he had spent the last 20 minutes trying to figure out the problem. Now that he had at least somewhat of an answer, he would have to pass on his findings to Ilyaheim. For now, he thought it would be best if they did not fight in the park again. Matuzokan was a shrewd man, if he could even be called a man any longer. His shrewdness had helped him create the Heavens Feel ritual, and it had helped him live the long life that he had lived so far. He had watched as his family slowly declined and became the mess that it was today.
The person who was supposed to carry on his legacy had no talent as a magus, and the other that he had adopted into his family had no desire to be one. It was because of this shrewdness that he had also decided to take a gamble and go to that damnable false priest who was moderating the current ritual. Zoken almost snorted as he walked down a hallway in his mansion at that thought. That man was dangerous, and Zoken had no doubt that as soon as he had outlived his usefulness, that false priest would try to find some way to stab him in the back. Granted, Zoken's thought process was fairly similar, but he hadn't survived this long by being caught off guard from those whom he deemed dangerous. The clack of his cane reverberated off the hallways as he steadily made his way towards his study. As he did so, his foolish embarrassment of a grandson made his appearance, looking quite frustrated. "I thought you said that book would help me win this stupid war." Zoken blinked at the outburst from the boy, before his eyes narrowed dangerously, causing Shinji to balk as he realized the tone and words he had just addressed his grandfather in. "It seems you are too weak to participate in this war after all. Perhaps I should force Sakura to become Rider's master like I had originally intended." Shinji scowled at Zoken's words, but made no other comment. Zoken had decided that he had had enough of the boy for one day. You have a heroic spirit at your beck and call, and you can't even divert enough attention for her to set up her noble phantasm. I'd advise you to figure out what you plan to do to overcome this obstacle, rather than bemoan your lot in life to me. I've little time for your type of theatrics. Shinji's scowl deepened at that, but he still made no move to act on Zoken's harsh critique. The elder magus nodded, satisfied that he had at least somewhat cowed his grandson. "Remember who it was that gave you that book, Shinji? I can just as easily take it back." With those parting words, Zoken once more continued his walk toward his study. Once he arrived there, he made sure to lock the door and with a tap of his cane set up a temporary bounded field. "I think it's safe for you to materialize for now." Zoken's words were met with the flash of materialization. By the end of the flash, a disgruntled lancer had appeared within the old man's study. "I really don't like being passed around like I'm some kind of collectible item." Zoken chuckled darkly at Lancer's comment. "Well, for the time being you're working for me. As of right now I have only one order of business for you. I want you to find out Castor's true identity." Lancer sighed as he nodded his understanding of the order and astralized once more, just as a knock came on his study door. Zoken smiled. He had already talked to Shinji, so that left his other grandchild. He tapped his cane once more and the bounded field was taken down. He gave a gruff "come in" and the door opened to reveal Matu Sakura. She was still dressed in her school uniform, her ribbon attached to her purple hair like always. She approached him warily and gave a small bow. "I've returned for the night, grandfather." Zoken nodded his understanding and walked around his desk to sit down. "Nice of you to tell me. I saw Shinji around earlier today. I'm sure he'll be happy to see you." He took note of the minuscule pupil dilation at his grandson's name that she wasn't entirely able to suppress, but her face gave nothing away. Good, he had trained her well. "If that is all, I think it best if you retire for the day. The coming weeks will no doubt be quite busy." Sakura nodded and walked out the door once more. Zoken couldn't quite keep the smile that played across his face as she exited. That particular project was coming along nicely. He supposed that her trips to the Amiya household were building up her defensive walls. It would make it all the better when he would tear them down to achieve his own goals. Archer stood atop the tallest building of the city, once more keeping a vigil. What he was keeping a vigil for he wasn't entirely sure, but he would stay vigilant throughout the rest of this war. The day was mild and he took a moment to close his eyes and enjoy the fair weather despite the fact that it was currently winter in the city. Even though he was now a servant summoned for this war, it was nice to be able to relax for a moment and not be attacked from all sides. That would be coming soon enough. "Well, this is an interesting place to spend your day." Archer whirled around at the unknown voice, traced blades already in his hand. However, before he could start a confrontation, the man that had appeared near him held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Whoa, relax for a second. I know about the rule that we only really fight at night, and for the time being I'll be honoring that rule." With a jolt, Archer realized that Assassin had just gotten the drop on him and he wouldn't have been able to do anything to counter. He decided to give the Servant of the Shadows the benefit of the doubt, as that had been the perfect time to strike and Assassin hadn't taken it. He dismissed his blades back into his reality marble and straightened from his fighting stance warily. "I must admit, I wasn't expecting to run into you." Assassin smiled at those words and with a jolt Archer realized how true his statement was. Assassin should be confined to the temple.
How the hell was he walking around the city?
Apparently Rin's fear of him randomly popping up and killing all the masters wasn't as laughable as he thought. Well, I just thought it would be nice to greet someone who was watching their own ally from the shadows last night. Archer did nothing to give away that he had in fact been observing the battle between Saber and Assassin last night, but Assassin seemed content to continue on his observations. You also made the move to strike against Itachi-chan. Gotta say he was a bit more beat up than I had anticipated when he got back last night. I had to meet the guy who could do that to him. He's kind of a bit of a scary fellow after all. Archer made no comment at that. After all, Castor had trapped him in an illusion the first time they met. Assassin then looked Archer up and down, before smiling slightly.
Well, you seem like a pretty interesting guy, so let me give you a bit of advice.
Suddenly Assassin's eyes hardened and the killing intent on the roof seemed to make the air molasses. Even Archer felt his breath taken away by the strength of it, and he had encountered some very powerful forces up to this point.
I'd advise you not to take a surprise shot at him again. He's rather important to the plan I have going on right now, and I need him. Try what you did last night again.
Assassin trailed off as he instantly appeared behind Archer so that they were standing back to back. Archer's eyes widened, he hadn't even seen the man move. Your life is mine, I tagged you with something very special before I revealed myself.
Remember this, your fate rests in my hands now.
Archer whirled around only to find that Assassin had disappeared once more. Shaking his head, Archer gazed out over the city once more.
What a terrifying man.
Assassin flashed back to the temple, just in time to see Castor walking out into the sun.
He raised a hand in greeting to the man. Nice to see you up and about, Itachi-chan.
The sun's beginning to go down.
Are you going to be okay for tonight? Castor nodded as he answered Assassin. Of course, Yandame-sama.
Assassin then turned his attention skyward. The sun marked that it was fairly late afternoon, so they still had a bit of time before they began moving.
I was going over the report you left me, so Zoken might be a bit of a problem in this? Castor answered after a moment of collecting his thoughts.
The problem is I'm not entirely sure where his actual body is being kept. As of right now, we'd only be fighting an incomplete being if we went after him. Assassin nodded his understanding at this. Well then, I suppose that's what you're going to work on tonight. Find out where Zoken keeps his real body.
We'll need to know that to really move forward.
Castor nodded his acceptance at those orders, and the two fell into a companionable silence. It was Castor that eventually broke it. Naruto-kun will be looking for you soon. Once he knows that you have been summoned, he will undoubtedly want to help with our cause. Assassin regarded Castor for a moment before speaking.
Do you want him to join us, Itachi-chan?
You're fairly fond of him yourself. Castor seemed to think over Assassin's suggestion for a moment before ultimately shaking his head in the negative. I think he'll do more good as he is now.
We'll handle it for now.
Assassin nodded his acceptance at Castor's statement. He'll eventually find out that I've been summoned and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. For now, focus on Zoken.
We need to find his true body.
Castor gave a slight nod at Assassin's order before he glanced at the slowly darkening sky.
I suppose I'll begin now.
With that statement, Castor began walking at a sedate pace towards the Matu Manor once more. Even if Zoken had something set up to alert him to intruders, Assassin was confident in Castor's ability to remain undetected. He folded his arms and began his vigil of the temple once more. Hopefully this night would have something to entertain him like the last one did.
Berserker walked into the library to find Ilya once more poring over books.
He raised an eyebrow at this, but shrugged as he made his way over to her.
Researching once more, Ilyaheim?
She jumped a bit at his sudden presence, and glared at him. It'd be a lot easier if you just explained a bit about who you were instead of having to rely on dreams and research that tells me nothing.
Berserker nodded along with Ilya's venting. I see how that can be a cause of stress. Ilya rolled her eyes at her servant's nonchalance.
I'll forget about that for now. I think it's time we start figuring out strategies to deal with the servants that we've encountered so far. Berserker hummed in agreement to her thought process, and she continued.
As of now, we've at the very least come into contact with every other servant other than Assassin. I think he might be holed up in that temple.
Berserker sidled into the seat across from his master, studying the text that she had open in front of her.
The Epic of Gilgamesh?
Ilya gave a grunt of agreement as she placed her head in her hands. I've been going over one of the oldest stories known to man, and so far I haven't found anything that sounds as if it could be alluding to you or Castor.
How old are you two?
Berserker grinned as he leaned back in his chair and flipped through the text. I don't know if there is any written language that houses our legends. Let's just say that when I was alive there was only one language in the world and only one continent. Ilya felt her jaw drop at that little revelation. How is that possible? Berserker merely shrugged in response to Ilya's outburst. No idea, the fact that Castor and I are here means that someone probably knew of our legend, although I have no idea who. Ilya sighed in frustration at that. It seemed she was getting nowhere in the search for her own servant's legend. Shaking her head, she decided to get back to the matter at hand. I suppose I'll have to look into that later. As of right now, I think the biggest threat in this war is assassins simply because we haven't encountered them yet and they'll have presence concealment. Berserker thought over his master's reasoning. At the moment, the only other thorn in his side was Lancer. He was fairly confident that he could take on Saber and Archer. Even though Ryder had caught him off guard, he was sure in his ability to take her down if push came to shove. However, he grimaced as he thought of Itachi. No matter how he looked at it, Itachi was going to be a problem. I think I understand your reasoning. Assassin is an unknown quantity at the moment and he might be a game changer, but I think it might be in our best interests to check out the school once more. Ryder had been spending a lot of effort to erect those seals. Just because we were able to stop her last night doesn't mean she'll just stop trying. Ilya narrowed her eyes at that. We could possibly spring a trap if she does in fact return to the school. Not to mention I'm fairly certain that was the school that Oniai-chan and that Obasan attended, so we might get 3 for the price of 1. Ilya closed her eyes in contemplation. On the one hand, there may be 3 servants and masters appearing within that school. On the other, Assassin was an unknown quantity and he could be quite a troublesome opponent if he wasn't at least identified soon. Ilya's eyes opened as she came to a decision. Even if Assassin is an unknown quantity, 3 servants and masters in one area is too good an opportunity to pass up. We'll be heading back to the school tonight. Berserker nodded his understanding and gave his customary half-bow in response to Ilya's decision. As you wish, Ilyaheim. Shiro was seriously questioning his decision to go snooping around the school at the moment. The dying light of the sun cast the school in reds and oranges, but it was the sense of someone observing him that was setting his senses into overdrive and on edge. He had been discovering strange sigils throughout the school all day with Tosaka, and together they had been slowly but surely deconstructing them. However, Tosaka had stated that it was a bit too easy. The sigils were coming down as if they were already weakened, and both Shiro and Tosaka had no explanation as to why that had occurred. Unfortunately for them, they had underestimated how long their task would take. The sun was quickly setting as they tried to finish dismantling whatever it was that was being set up in the school. That had led to a whole new set of problems. Shiro had noticed her first and had tackled Tosaka to the ground, rolling to make sure that they didn't injure themselves. As he had fallen, he felt a biting pain in his shoulder, and when he had come up from the roll he had realized that a strange nail-like dagger had sliced into him, though he had managed to avoid any serious injury as it was more of a glancing blow. He felt himself panting as a sense of vertigo took over his senses and his shoulder began to burn as he took stock of his wound. Damn it! Tosaka! Get out of here while I distract her. Tosaka opened her mouth to protest, but he hadn't let her and had charged headlong into the opposing servant. She seemed rather surprised that he had been stupid enough to try a frontal charge, and that was the only reason he could think of that he wasn't dead, as she had swatted him away into an unused classroom. He felt all of his senses run on overdrive as he contemplated how to get out of this situation. His contemplations were cut short as the servant blurred into the classroom and slammed into him, once more sending him flying out of the glass. That wasn't good. He had been on the 3rd story when they had encountered the servant, and now he was falling. Summoning every ounce of will, he did the only thing that he could think of. Come to me, Saber. He felt a burning as a command sigil flaked off his hand in response to his will. Space and time bent, enabling Saber to appear and catch him before they landed lightly on the ground. Saber had a grim countenance as she observed his wounds and frazzled appearance before she looked up to catch sight of the female servant leaning out the window to witness his fall. It seems that you can't be let out of my sight at all. What a troublesome master. Saber gently placed him on his feet as he chuckled a bit ruefully. Well, I wasn't expecting to be attacked quite like that. Saber glanced at Shiro for a moment before returning her gaze to the other female servant. The purple-haired servant then hopped out the window and fell the 3 stories to land lightly on her feet. I'd have preferred to have taken him out of the competition with that attack. Saber said nothing as she widened her stance, and Shiro saw her grip her hands in the familiar gesture as if she was holding an invisible sword. I must admit, I'm feeling rather cross with my master at the moment. Enemies are everywhere, and he did not heed my advice when it is clear that he should have. Shiro winced at Saber's rather flowery way of saying "I told you so." He supposed he deserved that. For a moment neither of the servants moved, each was sizing the other up, waiting for one or the other to make the first move. Just when Shiro saw the female servant tense, a new voice entered the fray. "Hell yeah, totally called it. What did I say, Iliaheim? We got 2 for the price of 1. Shiro turned his head so fast that he felt another sense of vertigo, a reminder that he was in fact injured at the moment. As he got his swimming vision back under control, he got a glimpse of who had just spoken. He really wished that the voice that he had heard hadn't matched who he was expecting to see. Standing a little off from Saber and the female servants' showdown was Ilya and Berserker. Both of them were wearing fairly evil smirks as they took in the situation. "It seems you were right, Berserker. Now all we need is the archer, and we have another servant to kill tonight. Tell me, where is the Tosaka heir?" Shiro shivered at the promise of blood in Ilya's eyes, but she was patted on the head by her servant before it could really come to anything. Now, none of that. We got enough here to entertain us for the time being." Ilya rolled her eyes at her servant's antics, but she seemed to calm down a little at his touch. "I suppose you're right, it wouldn't do to be too greedy now, would it?" "Berserker." Shiro watched on as Berserker straightened to attention at his master's commanding voice. "Go wild." Berserker's grin became fairly devilish as he took in the other 2 servants. "With pleasure, Iliaheim." Chapter 9, Third Night. Berserker felt himself tensing in anticipation as he eyed the 2 servants across from him. He knew that he was in the best position in this little scuffle, because out of the 3 of them he was the only one that had actually fought the other 2. Granted, they probably weren't giving it their all at the time, but still, that was a good advantage to have. The 3 servants stood perfectly still as they regarded each other, the slowly setting sun beginning to envelope the school in dark shadows, rather than the rather vibrant red and gold from dusk. The colors were instead moving towards the purple and burgundy of the early evening. Berserker kept his eye on both his opponents, not willing to let either get the drop on him. However, their stalemate couldn't last forever, and it was Ryder that made the first move. With a twist of her wrist, the strange nail dagger shot out towards Saber. The servant of the sword regarded the weapon coolly as she flawlessly raised her invisible blade and parried the attack. The dagger was sent spinning into the air, but Ryder instantly appeared within Saber's guard. Saber's eyes had never left Ryder's form, and she was able to spin around the upward kick that Ryder lashed out with and use the force of her spin to slash at Ryder's exposed back. It was at this point that Berserker took his opening. Ryder was able to deflect the blade with her chain, but Saber was exposed and had shown her back to Berserker. In an instant he was behind her and attempting to plunge a kunai into her neck. Unfortunately, it seemed that some force had warned her of the imminent threat, and she ducked right before the blade could pierce her exposed neck. Berserker's eyes widened as he felt her foot then connect with his stomach, and he was sent flying backwards. Ryder wasn't sitting idle in that exchange as she lashed out with another kick. This time it connected with Saber's chin and sent the servant of the sword sprawling before she managed to right herself again. However, Berserker gave her no time to think as he flung a kunai her way and then rushed forward and engaged Ryder in combat. He had learned something from his last encounter with this particular servant. She enjoyed using her speed and flexibility to get around people's guards, but he had decided that he wouldn't let her get away with that this time. As he approached her, he leaned forward to duck under her extended leg as she attempted to kick him. She wanted flexibility, let's see how she dealt with this. He then shot his foot upward and felt the satisfying thump as he connected with her chin. She then was blasted upward by the amount of force he had put into that kick, but he wasn't done yet. He forced himself to move as quickly as he possibly could when not in sage mode and appeared behind the blindfolded servant in a blur. He then grasped her in a hold, pinning her arms, right before gravity started to once more take a hold of the 2. As he descended, he began to spin. They spun faster and faster, until he finally let go at the last second and flipped around to land on his feet. Ryder, on the other hand, wasn't as fortunate. She crashed into the ground and sent up an explosion of dust and pebbles as she utterly obliterated the ground that she had hit. Berserker took a moment to admire his handiwork, but then he grimaced as he ducked a slash from Saber's invisible blade. He formed a Rasengan as quickly as he could and spun around to deliver the blow into the servant like last time. Unfortunately for him, she had anticipated this move and had already brought her blade to bear. He was sure the blow jarred her arms greatly, but she was able to block his attack, even if it sent her skidding back. Berserker gazed at her for a moment, before he then flipped over Ryder's nail-like dagger which had shot out of the dust. Damn, looked like she was made of some pretty strong stuff. He landed lightly on his feet as the three of them paused for a moment to collect themselves. Not bad, Saber-chan. Looks like you can learn some new tricks after all. I wasn't really expecting that kick. Saber grimaced at his nickname, but she nodded her head in acknowledgement of the compliment. It seems to me that we may be overestimating you. Or perhaps underestimating you. That was a brilliant move you used on her. Saber nodded in Ryder's direction, who of the three of them was the only one out of breath. She was also still on a bent knee, clearly still disoriented from the attack that Berserker had used on her. Berserker gave his own nod of acknowledgement at that. Thanks, but that wasn't even my move. The real version of the attack was a lot more damaging than the bastardized version that I can pull off. Saber's eyes widened at that and glanced at Ryder's state. Already the purple-haired servant had begun to catch her breath, but she had a wound above her eye that had blood flowing down her face. That's a bold statement. You were able to cause that much damage and you can't even perform the attack, right? Berserker chuckled at that. Yeah, I learned it from a friend a long time ago, but he's the one who could really use that move. If he had done it, I'm pretty sure we would have had our first casualty in this war. Ryder looked as if she had been following Saber and his conversation, if the look of relief was anything to go by as she gracefully got to her feet. Berserker considered his two opponents for a moment. He had been taking it entirely too easy on the servants of this war. They were heroes reincarnated with a wish that they desperately wanted granted, and he had been a fool for not constantly giving it his best. Well, he supposed it was time to step it up. He created a clone in a burst of smoke. The clone then plopped down on the floor in a meditative position. He would abuse the hell out of Sage Mode from now on, but first he needed to buy time for his clone to gather the natural energy to do so. Fun as it was picking on Saber, he supposed it was time to give Ryder a go. Well, you can't say it was a bad flight, right, Ryder-chan? Ryder stiffened as he threw his knowledge of her class out as well as the informal way he greeted her. It seemed that he still had that innate ability to get under people's skin. It was a bit more fun than he cared to admit. It seems that I have been taking you too lightly. Berserker didn't like the sound of that. It looked as though Ryder was about to stop her opening salvo and get into the real stuff. Well, he was a bit curious as to what other noble phantasms he might face. So far he'd only really gone against Lancer's spear, and if all noble phantasms were the troublesome he would have a problem. Ryder drew herself up to her full height and then yanked her chain so that her dagger flew into her waiting palm. Berserker tensed as Ryder's fingers curled around the weapon, but he only felt confusion a moment later when Ryder turned the blade on herself. He glanced over to Saber, and judging by the way her mouth had dripped open, she too was feeling a bit of confusion as to what Ryder was up to. However, it was made apparent what she was doing a moment later as she plunged the blade into her neck. Berserker's eyes widened at the action and he saw Saber tense as a spray of blood spurt from the wound. It then began forming a seal of some sort, and Berserker had the sinking suspicion that Ryder was about to perform some form of summoning. After all, they hadn't seen why she was classified as Ryder quite yet. Suddenly the seal became an eye, the sight of which actually caused Berserker to pause. The eye was bound by the blood that Ryder had sent into the air. Then the eye pulsed and a creature burst forth. Berserker saw a blur of white and then Ryder's mount came to a rest before her. Berserker took in the beast that she had called appearance and had the sinking suspicion that he probably should have stopped her from summoning that thing. Ilya felt her jaw drop as she saw the Pegasus manifest before Ryder. She had been confident in her servant's victory, but this might have changed the game a little bit. A Pegasus was a divine beast, and since Ryder was able to call it to her, she was obviously connected to its legend. She knew that there weren't many females that came into contact with the Pegasus, and she had the sneaking suspicion that she now knew the reason behind Ryder's blindfold. Ilya took the time to glance over at Oniya-chan and realized that though he was breathing a bit heavily, he had mostly recovered from the wound that Ryder had inflicted upon him. However, she knew that in this battle of titans the two of them were next to useless. Ilya studied him for a moment more before turning her attention back to the battle. She may be able to concoct a plan to at least take Ryder out of the equation. Rin winced as she looked down at the disaster in the schoolyard. Amiya was now down another command spell, and the writer of this war had just summoned a freaking Pegasus of all things.
Rin was feeling fairly outclassed at the moment and way too exposed. She had to get Archer to her now.
She looked down at her hand, mentally debating whether or not using another command spell would be worth it if she could get her servant to her side immediately. Almost as soon as she had that thought, she cast it aside. She had no urge to waste one of her most powerful tools in this war just because she was feeling a little out of her league at the moment. Sighing in defeat, she decided that for this particular fight she would just be an observer. If Archer could get here before this was over, then she would join in.
Castor was once more making his way down the street toward Zokan's mansion.
He would have to be much more careful with his approach in the future, but he had always excelled at the more Black Ops types of the shinobi arts. However, he sensed that he was not as alone as he would like as he came to a halt in the middle of the street. There, standing in his path, was a man in all blue leaning on a contrasting blood-red spear.
Castor's eyes moved to the spear as his Sharingan activated.
With that done, he could now see the barely constrained prana that was emanating from the spear, as well as the barely contained bloodlust.
I see. You must be the Lancer. Lancer's eyebrows rose at Castor's monotonous observation.
What gave it away?
Was it the spear?
Lancer questioned Castor sarcastically as he brandished his spear a little. Castor's eyes narrowed in thought as he realized that ever since appearing, Lancer hadn't made eye contact with him.
I see, someone told you not to look me in the eye.
Lancer merely smirked at Castor's question as he went back to leaning on his spear.
Maybe, maybe not. I've been tasked with getting some information on what exactly you're up to.
Find out who you are, but the weird thing is, I've got no idea who your master is. Care to share what happened to them? Castor stayed quiet as he observed Lancer. Despite the man's attempt at casualness, he detected quite a bit of tension. His eyes could see the barely restrained muscles as Lancer prepared for any attack. It seems that I will not be able to get past you without a conflict. How unfortunate. Lancer grinned as he eased into a stance, still not looking up to lock eyes with Castor.
Well, if that's the way it's gotta be.
I've always found I can identify others through a fight better than anything else. Castor gave a slight incline of his head in acknowledgement to Lancer's observation before he slipped into his own stance, two kunai falling into his hands.
Then, by all means, let's begin.
Berserker eyed the winged horse warily. This was definitely up there as a rider class mount.
It was probably a divine beast.
His eyes narrowed in thought as he gazed at the thing.
Damn, he was gonna have to use Sage Mode now.
With the thought, his clone cancelled and he felt the rush of entering Sage Mode. Now that he could actually feel the beast, he almost grimaced.
That thing was a fountain of prana.
It felt almost as if another servant had been summoned. Whatever this thing was, it was strong, and Ryder's riding skill had to be damn good for her to be able to control it. He gave another glance at Saber and saw that her hands had clenched so hard on her blade that he thought she might be trying to snap her hilt. It seemed she definitely recognized the thing.
Time to take the initiative then.
Before Ryder could turn towards her mount, Berserker was rocketing toward her. Ryder grimaced as she narrowly dodged his fist, but Berserker merely grinned.
Suddenly Ryder was being thrown back by an unseen force.
She rolled to her feet, but then Saber was there, an overhead slash already in motion. Berserker was about to go help her, but the winged horse smashed into his side, sending him skidding backwards. Damn, that felt like one of the toads had smacked into him. Wait, he had actually somewhat felt that, more so than most of the things that he had been hit with so far. What the hell? Berserker narrowed his eyes as he considered the beast from across from him. A quick glance in the direction of Ryder and Saber confirmed that they were still duking it out, if the sound of metal crashing against metal was anything to go by. Berserker snapped his attention back to the horse, just in time to see a white blur charging at him.
He grits his teeth and planted his feet.
The horse crashed into him like a 10-ton toad, and he felt his back foot crack down into the ground. With a strained yell, Berserker lifted the beast off the ground and threw it. He realized his mistake a moment later as it righted itself in the air and shot toward Ryder. Ryder kicked Saber in the chest, sending the servant skidding away before back flipping onto her mount. God damn it, now she was going to be even worse. Before he could make a move, that damn dagger came flying at him again. He sighed as he deflected it with the back of his fist. Then he had a bit of a devious idea, time to see if it would work. Grinning, he reached out and grabbed the chain the dagger was attached to. He thought he would be able to pull Ryder back down to earth, but that mount of hers was strong and fast, so the natural conclusion was that he felt himself achieve liftoff. Son of a bitch. Saber felt her mouth drop open as Berserker reached out and grabbed the chain and then subsequently went flying with Ryder. Saber growled as she considered her options. Both of those servants were problems and she needed to take them out as soon as possible, but now Ryder had a distinct advantage since she was airborne and Saber was not. Saber's eyes snapped to the sky as she felt a rush of wind. Unfortunately, she also felt a massive influx of prana emitting from Ryder. It seemed that she was about to meet Ryder's noble phantasm. If that was the case, then she had no choice. Though it would probably demolish much of the school, the only way she could envision coming out victorious was if she used her own noble phantasm in response. She was confident that her own phantasm would be able to obliterate Ryder, and if she was lucky, Berserker as well. Castor and Lancer had yet to move from their starting positions. Though both felt the thrum of fight about to take place, they were both unwilling to make the first move. Well, Castor supposed he would have to remedy that. He flung his kunai at Lancer's throat, but the blue-clad servant easily deflected the blow. However, Castor was already in motion following his discarded kunai and extended his leg into a kick right after Lancer deflected the blade. Lancer grinned as he shifted his spear so that Castor only smashed into the shaft. Castor used his forward momentum to continue forward and reacquire the wildly spinning thrown kunai as it sailed over Lancer's head. Castor then flipped over Lancer and stabbed at the back of the servant's neck. Unfortunately, as soon as Castor had flipped over Lancer's head, the servant was already in motion. He ducked the blow and lashed out with a back kick. Castor deflected the kick with his forearm, but before he could do anything else, Lancer had spun so that he wouldn't be prone to an attack from behind, swinging his spear as he did so. Castor grimaced as he switched the kunai from offense to defense, blocking the shaft of the spear, but was unable to stop himself from skidding back from the force of the blow. That was an interesting opening salvo. It seemed this man could mix some unarmed combat into his style, despite the fact that he was the servant of the lance. This one was becoming a bit of a dangerous opponent. Castor warily eyed the spear. He didn't know exactly what the weapon did yet, but it was obviously Lancer's noble phantasm, so it should be regarded with caution. Perhaps he would have to use Amaterasu to finish the servant, but he didn't want to run the risk of blinding himself if Lancer found some way to slip past his attack. Lancer's grin had only widened throughout the entire exchange, his demeanor becoming more feral as he fought Castor. Damn, are you sure you're the Castor class? I didn't think they were supposed to be good at up-close and personal combat. Castor quirked an eyebrow at that. Well, if Lancer wanted more long-ranged attacks, then perhaps it was time to up the ante. He flashed through a series of hand signs and inhaled a deep breath. When he released it, an enormous fireball went flying toward Lancer. Lancer's eyes widened as he saw the fireball approaching him, but he was able to dodge it fairly easily by jumping to the side. Castor was already in motion after firing his attack and appeared right in front of Lancer. The servant's eyes widened, but he was able to block Castor's attacks and landed a kick that sent Castor skidding back once more. Castor winced as he straightened. It seemed that he had no choice. He could get the man into an illusion, but it would be easier if he just took care of this problem now. Castor grimaced as he closed his eyes and began to concentrate. For a moment he just concentrated, sending his power into his right eye. He felt the OD within him building, begging to be let out. Hey now, I can't let you go releasing whatever that is. Castor grimaced as he sensed Lancer rushing in front of him. He ducked and let go of his technique. He needed more time to truly utilize Amaterasu. Perhaps he could catch the servant in a Tsukuyami. That would have to do. It would be less messy as well. Unfortunately, before he could utilize one of his greatest genjutsu, he received a vicious kick to the abdomen that sent him flying. He grimaced as he felt his recently healed injuries from using Susanoo groan in protest. Castor grit his teeth and forged through the pain. Well, he supposed it was time to retreat from this battle. It seemed as though he wasn't as healed as he had originally thought. With a concentration of OD, he dispersed into a flock of crows and left the area. Saber inhaled deeply as she calmed her nerves. Now was not the time for any more doubts. She had chosen her course of action and she would follow it through. Her victory was assured now that she had decided to push forward with her true noble phantasm. She would utterly obliterate Rider with this next attack. She widened her stance as she exhaled and held her blade above her head. For a moment nothing happened, but then, slowly, her weapon began to reveal itself. The hilt was first and then the crossguard, before the blade itself was revealed in all its glory. Saber felt herself smiling as her true noble phantasm was exposed to the world. It was time to call it forth and achieve a promised victory. She would hold back as much as she could to avoid destroying any other parts of the city other than the school. Saber began to gather mana to her sword. Gentle particles began to gather toward her gold and blue blade, the lettering of the Fae bathed in a golden light. She felt her sword sing to her. She felt the weight that it exuded, of all warriors' ends, past, present, and future. She grits her teeth determinedly as she held the sword of promised victory above her head, charging it with prana as the entire schoolyard was bathed in a golden hue, as though fairies had decided to come and see the sword that they had gifted her. She would only have one chance at this. She would make it count. Berserker's eyes widened as he caught sight of Saber's blade, revealed at last to the world. He felt something tug at his heart, as though that sword would ring victory to all those who were deemed worthy to wield it. He watched on as light began to emit from the schoolyard, casting it in a golden hue, all of that energy gathering toward Saber's now exposed blade. He was still in sage mode, so he could feel the prana that thing was emitting. It was ridiculously massive, in fact it might even be a match for a bijou dama. He shook his head and turned his attention back to Rider, who was looking down upon Saber with contempt. It seemed that she was quite wary of Saber's attack and for a moment hesitated. However, the moment quickly came to an end. She nodded to herself, and then a shining gold harness, bridle, and saddle formed onto the winged horse and Rider reined the horse in. It doesn't matter what trick you use, Saber. No one survives against my attack. Berserker then felt a massive flux of mana being pulled toward Rider's person, but he felt that it wasn't nearly enough to stand up to the monstrosity that was Saber's attack. It just wasn't in the same league as Saber's own noble phantasm it seemed. Berserker decided that it was better to cut his losses and let go of the chain that he had been holding onto. He fell onto the roof and rolled. Just as he righted himself, he heard Rider shout her noble phantasm's name. Bellerophon. Berserker looked on as Rider became a streak of white rocketing toward Saber, who was still gathering energy for her own attack. It seemed that this conflict would be coming to an end rather soon. Berserker would make sure to take out whoever was left standing. Saber grimaced as she viewed Rider diving toward her at an insane speed. She knew that she needed a little more mana to boost the prana of the attack, but this would have to do. Even with this much, she should be able to utterly destroy the enemy servant. Unfortunately, it appeared that Berserker had let go of his ride and ended up somewhere that was most likely out of her range. Saber inhaled deeply, hyper-aware of her surroundings. Even though Rider was rocketing towards her, it almost seemed as if she was in slow motion to Saber. Rider's rapid descent caused her to wait. She had to wait for the optimal time. Just as it seemed as though Rider would be able to collide with her, Saber made her move. X-dash. Saber held all the gathered prana to her for a moment, preparing herself for the blast that was to come. Caliba. With that cry she planted her foot and swung her blade down with all her might, releasing the gathered prana. Berserker felt his jaw drop when he saw Saber slash downward and shout her noble phantasm's name. It seemed that the servant of the sword was really holding out if she had that particular ace up her sleeve. He watched as Rider's white streak headed straight for the golden force that had erupted from Saber's blade. It would be no contest. For all of Rider's skill, she just wouldn't be able to match the power that was being thrown at her. Hell, he was pretty sure his Raisin Shuriken wouldn't be able to match that. If he decided to fight Saber for keeps, he would probably have to resort to using his own locked-away noble phantasm. Even though he was watching from a distance, he could admit that the golden light was beautiful. The power from it sang to his warrior soul, promising victory to all who witnessed it and were allies, and defeat for enemies. It seemed that this would be the end of Rider. Too bad, he hadn't really gotten to know her quite yet. However, just before the light of Excalibur reached Rider, something strange happened. Berserker almost did a double take as it seemed as though the attack was just cut off. What the hell? He turned his attention to Rider and realized that she too had been stopped. but unlike the attack from Saber, she was being held in check by something that Berserker was very familiar with. If the ghostly image of a person emerging from the ground with a shield was anything to go by, it looked as though Itachi had decided to join the party. Curious, he decided that he needed to see what was going on, but before he could move, a massive explosion of energy went off above him. He winced as he looked to the sky and saw that Saber's attack had somehow been redirected to about 200 feet in the sky, lighting up the night as if a sun had just decided to bloom into existence. Before it could really get going, it stopped suddenly. Berserker glanced down and realized that Saber must have cancelled the technique. He glanced in the direction of Itachi and also realized that Susanoo had been cancelled as well, though it looked as though a disgruntled rider was staring down towards the dust that had suddenly appeared in the middle of the schoolyard from both Riders and Saber's attacks. Well, time to see what was going on, he supposed. Saber grimaced as she felt the massive depletion of prana from using her noble phantasm. Damn it, she had been careless. Someone or something had come in and completely redirected her attack into the sky, pretty much guaranteeing that she hadn't been able to land a hit on Rider. She tried to squint into the dust to see who Rider's mysterious savior was, but at the moment she could see nothing. She was considering her options when she heard the light tread of feet coming up beside her. Glancing to her left, she saw that Berserker had returned and that he was still in the state where his eyes became toad-like. He chuckled as he saw her expression. "Goddamn, Saber-chan. That was a hell of an attack. I didn't expect something like that to come from someone so tiny." Saber frowned in annoyance at the blonde servant's antics before she turned her attention back to the dust cloud which was still obscuring her vision. "Obviously I didn't want to go all out in our fights, Berserker. That is what it means to have a trump card." She then realized that she had just used said trump card in front of both Berserker and his master, as well as the fact that it had failed in its intended purpose of taking Rider out of the war for good. She felt her frown turn into a scowl as she realized that she had just wasted that massive amount of prana for nothing. She was now dangerously low, and she had no idea if she would be able to fight any other servants for tonight, much less someone of Berserker's caliber nor someone who had the ability to redirect her noble phantasm. She was now at a distinct disadvantage. She felt her eyes drawn towards the dust as it began to clear. The outline of two silhouettes were beginning to take form. She scowled even harder. She knew these two. Of course, they would be working together, it just had to be that way. She was trying to calculate a way to retreat the instant she caught sight of them. She had fought both of them and had been soundly defeated both times. She also hadn't been able to think of any countermeasures against either yet, much less both at the same time. However, just before she was going to withdraw, take Shiro and get the hell out of Dodge, she felt Berserker stiffen up beside her. Curious, she glanced to her right and saw that he had locked his eyes onto one of the silhouettes. Curious, Saber also turned her gaze toward them. As the dust cleared completely, she was struck once more by how similar Berserker and Assassin looked. Berserker had landed next to Saber and had had a bit of fun teasing her once more. However, once he turned his attention to the two figures that were beginning to be revealed, he felt himself tensing for a fight. Whoever was working with Itachi had to be pretty damn good, and Itachi had only mentioned that he had met Assassin. Perhaps it was Itachi's master that had blocked Saber's attack? But that made no sense. Berserker wouldn't underestimate any of the masters, but he had felt the attack Saber had unleashed. Nothing other than another servant could have redirected it like it had been. As the dust finally began to clear, Berserker took note of Itachi first. The man was stoic as ever, even if his back was facing him at the moment. Berserker debated whether or not it would be a good idea to target Itachi's exposed back, but then he caught sight of the other person who had accompanied Itachi and had blocked Saber's attack, and felt his breath catch in his throat. No! No! His eyes met another shade of blue and took in the appearance of the other servant, because that's all he could be. For a moment father and son locked eyes, and it lasted an eternity, before Namake's Minato broke the impromptu staring contest first by smiling indulgently at his son. "It's good to see you again, Naruto." Berserker sighed as his father acknowledged him, one thought running through his mind. "I fucking hate this war." Chapter 10, Third Night, Kant. Berserker had been making contingency plans for pretty much everything up to this point in the war, but he felt all of his hard work go out the window as he stared at his father. God damn it, who's gonna pop up next? The first Hokage? It's slightly unbecoming to stare, Naruto. Berserker tensed at those words. Whatever reason for his father to be here would have to be figured out at a later date. Right now he had to gauge how much shit he was actually in. Before any of the others could move, Berserker had already crossed the distance between him and his father, a Rasengan already formed in his right hand. If the fourth was surprised at his sudden move, he didn't show it and merely redirected the attack by grabbing Berserker's wrist and flipping him away. Berserker recovered by righting himself in midair before landing on his feet and skidding back a bit. Well, plan a sneak attack hadn't worked, maybe he could try something different? Berserker glanced over at Saber and realized that she was a bit worse for wear. She was breathing much harder than he thought was normal and holding her sword far too loosely in the face of an enemy. Her last attack must have really taken a lot out of her. He glanced further on and realized that Itachi was still staring down the rider. Rider was also looking a bit under par, as she was obviously desperately trying to catch her breath so that she could take on these new enemies. Berserker was fairly certain she didn't stand a ghost of a chance at the moment. You really should pay more attention to the immediate threat, Naruto. Berserker's eyes widened as his father appeared right in front of him in a flash of yellow. He was able to narrowly dodge a swipe from the tri-pronged kunai by bending backwards. Letting a kunai of his own drop into his hand, he spun around and attempted to stab the fourth, only for him to come up empty as his father had once more flashed back to his starting position. Well, that was annoying. How the hell was he supposed to hit the bastard if he jumped like that? Berserker narrowed his eyes. If his dad wanted to up the speed game, then he would up the speed game. Before Minato was able to do anything else, Berserker had suddenly flashed right next to him and had another Rasengan flying toward him. Minato acted quickly and was able to dodge this attack by jumping backwards so that Berserker's Rasengan smashed into the floor, throwing up dust and dirt. Berserker frowned as he considered his father through narrowed eyes. Damn, that had been something he had been keeping to himself. He wasn't able to flash through those kunai as many times as his father, but he was sure he could manage a few. Minato grinned as he straightened. His eyes seemed to become more focused as he regarded Berserker once more. That was pretty good. Minato then widened his stance and brought up his fists. There were kunai interspersed through each knuckle. Round 1 is over. Let's see how you do in round 2. With that, he let the kunai fly. Despite the fact that the danger had just gone up tremendously, Berserker couldn't seem to keep the grin from spreading across his face. He had entered into this war hoping to fight strong opponents, and the opponent right in front of him was one of the strongest to ever live. He couldn't ask for anything better. Saber was currently cursing any deity that she had ever had an inkling of. She had been desperate to defeat Rider and had used her ultimate trump, her noble phantasm, and it had somehow failed to produce the desired results. She had given her all in that last attack, and it would have been enough had the two servants not decided to intervene on behalf of Rider. Now she was desperately trying to get her breathing back under control so she would be able to face the horror of a servant that was Castor. Her last encounter with him left no doubt that he was someone not to be underestimated, and the sad thing was that at this point in time she wasn't sure she could best him in combat. If the two had started out fresh, then it might have been possible, but she had been battling two other servants for quite a while, and then two servants that had bested her before decided to interfere. She was lucky Berserker seemed to be taking up all of Assassin's time. Now that she saw the two together, she would definitely say that they had a family resemblance, but that would be no help in trying to figure out either of their identities. Unfortunately, it seemed that Castor had been delegated to both her and Rider by default, and neither of them were as fresh as he was. Not to mention they each desired to see the other killed, so it was now a three-way standoff to see who would make the first move. Saber tensed as Castor slowly opened his eyes, revealing the spinning black tome against red. Damn, he had already activated his mystic eyes. She was fairly certain that she wasn't caught in an illusion at the moment, but she couldn't be entirely sure. Castor had gotten her before, he might be able to do so again. However, before Rider or Saber could move, Castor spoke. It might be better if we just leave it here for tonight. I have no desire to expend too much energy, and it would be detrimental to our plans if either of you were to die tonight. Saber narrowed her eyes at this. Are you saying that you would be able to defeat two servants so easily? What arrogance, Castor. Saber's words were more bravado than anything. She felt how weak she was at the moment. It was entirely possible that Castor might be able to make good on his promise. Rider seemed to be tilting her head to the side, as if trying to decide how best to get out of the situation she had found herself in. Castor merely glanced in her direction, but she could tell that most of his attention was still taken by Ryder. "Are you so quick to want death, Saber? I can tell that you've exhausted quite a bit of prana with that attack." It was probably meant as a trump card. If Assassin and I hadn't stepped in, Ryder would most likely have been the first casualty of the war. Saber grit her teeth in frustration at Castor's calm analysis of the situation. She may be greatly weakened, but she was certain she could still give Castor a good run, even if in the deepest recesses of her mind she admitted that she would most likely be nothing more than a glorified distraction. Her grip tightened on her sword in anger at that thought. Castor still hadn't moved from his spot, but he was also no longer keeping his attention on either her or Ryder. "How long are you going to hide, Archer?" Saber was confused at that because even extending her senses to account for servants she couldn't sense Archer, but Castor wasn't looking in anywhere near the school. Instead his gaze was locked firmly on the tallest building of Fuyuki. Suddenly Saber's senses went haywire as a servant rapidly approached the two of them. A second later Archer appeared with a flutter of his red jacket. "TCH. Those damn eyes of yours are annoying, to be able to see me even from that distance." Castor's focus was now firmly on Archer. Despite herself, Saber felt a bit of relief at the appearance of the red-clad servant. They were allies at the moment, and he was operating at full power. Castor narrowed his eyes as he observed Archer's stance, which seemed a bit non-threatening now that Saber had a chance to actually look at him. The servant of the bow hadn't even brought his swords into existence yet. However, before they could actually do anything, a resounding explosion rocked them all, and Saber's attention was dragged over to Berserker and Assassin's fight. It seemed that it had escalated somewhat as Berserker was now standing with a fist outstretched and a mad grin on his face. It looked as though he had finally hit Assassin and sent him through one of the walls of the school building. Saber was rather impressed that Berserker had been able to hit Assassin, but it seemed that victory was short-lived as Assassin appeared in a flash of yellow behind Berserker, a condensed ball of prana held in his hand. Saber watched on as Berserker seemed to realize that Assassin was behind him and he tried to jump away. Unfortunately he wasn't fast enough and got hit by the attack. Saber watched with a bit of satisfaction as Berserker's own attack was used against him and it was his turn to go flying into the school, creating another hole. However, unlike Berserker, Assassin knew the meaning of a follow-up and immediately dashed right towards the hole that Berserker had made, flinging a tri-pronged kunai after his prey and disappearing in a yellow flash once more. The other four servants had been left just staring after the two, before a new voice entered the fray. "Archer! Where the hell have you been?" Saber looked over at Archer, who had a somewhat sheepish look about him as he looked up to the hole Shiro had been driven out of. Saber followed his gaze and noticed an irate Rin looking down on the scene. "Well, it's a bit of a story." Berserker's ears were still ringing from that last attack. Son of a bitch, his dad could Rasengan with the best of them. He was beginning to feel the strain of using the Hiraishin as well. That damn thing wasn't technically a part of his legend and it was beginning to take a toll on his body. He wasn't used to traveling like that. Before he had enough time to recover, his dad was there again bearing down on him with a Rasengan in both hands. Yeah, he wasn't getting hit by that. Windmilling his legs, he spun and stuck to the wall just as Minato smashed the Rasengans into the spot he was a second ago. Not to be outdone, he formed a Rasengan of his own and kicked off the wall, but his dad was too damn fast. Minato whirled around the attack and caught Berserker with a back kick to the side that sent him crashing through another wall. Fortunately, this time it was only a kick and Berserker was able to recover by twirling through the air and landing on his feet. He winced as he landed, feeling the wound that Rasengan his dad had used to blast him in here. Well, now he knew what Lancer felt every time he took one of those. What was that man made of? Berserker hadn't even been hit point blank and it hurt like a bitch. It was more of a graze shot since he was already jumping away, allowing him to avoid most of the destruction of the technique. "You're doing pretty well. Why haven't you used the chakra mode yet?" Berserker flinched at Minato's question. Damn it, he was hoping his dad wouldn't notice that. Before he could give an answer, Minato was already answering for him. "I see, so Kurama is the one trapped in the mad enhancement, how tragic for him." Berserker glared at his father. This was definitely the toughest battle he had had so far in this war. Lancer was a bitch to put down for good, Saber and Ryder both had technique, and Itachi had Genjutsu going for him, but damn it, Namake's Minato was a bastard who ate armies for breakfast and then slew gods for lunch, all in time to kick some demon ass for dinner.
He was fast enough to dodge all of Berserker's attacks.
Even in Sage mode, it was difficult as all hell to sense him because of presence concealment. He was obviously an assassin with that skill, so now the question became why he hadn't just gone on a killing spree of all the masters and ended this damn thing.
"You're up to something, aren't you, Dad?"
Minato merely smiled at his son's accusation.
"Indeed.
I was actually the first servant summoned, and right after that Itachi came.
I immediately enlisted his help. However, rather than seeking out servants, he and I have been circumventing the system, as it were.
We've got a few things in motion, but for now I think I'll keep them to myself."
Berserker narrowed his eyes. "Not if I can beat the information out of you." Minato merely chuckled at Berserker's threat.
"You're certainly welcome to try. You might want to step it up though. Round 3's about to start. Let's see how you fare." With that, Minato flung a kunai towards his son and flashed through a series of hand signs. Berserker's eyes widened as he caught them, and suddenly there were at least 20 of the damn kunai, all surrounding him throughout the hall, top to bottom.
Fuck!
Although it had looked as though Castor had directed his full attention toward Archer, this was not the case.
He wanted it to appear that way.
It had taken a bit of luck on their part, but Castor and Minato had wanted to flush Ryder out. Phase 2 of their plans for the night was about to begin, and so she was the one that had his true full attention, even though it seemed as though Archer did. So, when she tried to slip away unnoticed, naturally he followed. It would probably take a few minutes before the other servants and masters gathered even noticed he was gone.
Sometimes it paid to have been an ANBU in a past life.
Ryder was swift in her departure, but she was also running low on prana, much like Saber. Her noble phantasm seemed to be a one-time use at the moment, and it was fairly easy for Castor to remain undetected as he tailed her. The two ended up a few blocks from the school down a side street that was more of an ally, before she finally came to a halt before the blue-haired man that he had seen the other night. Well then, he supposed it was time to set the Ryder free from her master.
"You stupid bitch."
Castor watched in indifference as the blue-haired youth decided to take the servant by the hair and fling her against the wall nearby. He then proceeded to stomp on her, aiming to hurt the purple-haired servant. All you had to do was make sure your bounded field was okay, but you can't even do that right.
How the hell am I supposed to win this with a useless excuse such as you?
Castor took note of the boy as he bled out of the shadows. There would be no surprises this time around, no Zoken, and Ryder was much weaker than last time as well.
"Good evening, Shinji-kun."
Matu Shinji stopped his abuse of his servant as he slowly glanced behind him, taking in Castor, the pale moon silhouetting the servant so that all Shinji could see was the blood-red eyes looking towards him. Shinji shivered at those eyes. It felt as though they held judgment and found him wanting.
Ryder dash.
Before he could complete his order, he was suddenly unable to breathe due to a kunai embedded in his throat. He reached up, scrambling weakly at the offending weapon before he collapsed to the ground, where he found he could breathe normally again, though it was ragged. Panting, he looked over to his servant and found her staring at the caster with an absent air. "I'm sorry to say, this time I came prepared for your servant, or should I say your borrowed servant." Shinji felt his breath stolen from him once more as he looked up at the caster.
"I am a man of peace, Shinji-kun.
You, however, are an agent that wants to spread discord. There is no peace for people like you, so I have come to be the judge, jury, and executioner." Shinji couldn't help but be drawn to the blood-red eyes, and then he saw them morph. Castor uttered one more word before Shinji was to learn of his fate.
"Tsukuyomi."
Suddenly Shinji was held on a cross and only Castor was in front of him. "This is one of the most powerful genjutsu in existence, Shinji-kun.
Here I am going to stab you, over and over, for 72 hours. By the time I am done, you will be broken, and then I will end your life."
With that, Castor lifted a blade that Shinji hadn't noticed before and pierced him in a non-vital spot, but it sure hurt like hell as the first scream tore from Shinji. He was then stabbed mercilessly, again and again and again. He felt his nerves fraying. It felt as if his very soul was on fire. By the end of it he was weeping. 71 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds to go, Shinji-kun, time is my domain here. Shinji could only weep in despair as he was once more assaulted. It would be a long 72 hours.
Castor came back to himself in the real world mere seconds after descending into Tsukuyomi.
The bastard of a master had fallen to his knees, face locked in a silent scream of agony as tears rushed down his face. His eyes no longer held any light in them. Castor had made sure to thoroughly crush the bastard. Castor walked forward with a casual gait, even though his right eye felt as if it was on fire. That combined with his use of Susanoo tonight, left him feeling drained, but he had enough energy for the next part. Reaching into his pouch, he lifted a kunai and held it against the blue-haired master's throat before he casually slit said master's throat and watched on as the young man slumped over, bleeding out. Castor waited a moment more before he walked to the student and felt for a pulse. Satisfied that there wasn't one, Castor picked up the recently made corpse and the still catatonic rider. Even with all of his nerves on fire, Castor still had one more job to do tonight. It was time to send a message to the old vampire who thought he knew everything there was to know about the Grail. Assassin had to admire his son's endurance if nothing else. Not many people could claim to have lasted this long against the barrage he was giving. However, he had always known that Naruto would have endurance in spades. Actually being on the other end of the fight was definitely more interesting than he had thought it would be. In the beginning, Naruto had surprised him by being able to utilize the Hiraishin, but as the fight wore on, he realized that each jump was taking its toll. Naruto was getting much slower than the beginning of the fight, and he was only just keeping up now. Assassin flashed to just underneath his son and shot his leg upward. The kick connected with Naruto's chin and sent him spiraling through the ceiling. Well, that should rattle something around in that head of his son's. Not wasting a moment, Assassin grabbed one of the kunai that littered the hall and tossed it through the hole he had just made, before flashing up to it. He appeared once more in a yellow flash on the school roof, Naruto once more waiting for him. His son was definitely feeling the toll of battle. He had been fighting before Assassin had even made an appearance, and the pace that had been set at the beginning of their fight had been extreme. You've done pretty well up to this point. I think it might be time to call a retreat though. Assassin hoped his son would see sense anymore, and he ran the risk of actually taking him out, and both Assassin and Itachi had worked far too hard to make sure that didn't happen quite yet. Yeah, one thing that hasn't changed since the day I died is that I never give up. With that said, Naruto once more rushed Assassin, and Assassin couldn't help the small smile that played across his face at his son's words. At least some things hadn't changed. Ilia was looking towards the roof of the school where her servant was currently fighting. There had been massive collateral damage this night in the school, what with the battle between 3 servants earlier and the carnage that was going on now, but it seemed the fight was no closer to ending than it had when it started. The two had been going at it for damn near 20 minutes now, and if they kept up the pace, they might accidentally bring the school down around their heads. Ilia shook her head in frustration as she looked over to the other master still near her. Oniai-chan looked much better than he had earlier, but it would still be quite simple to take him out of the game at the moment. His servants suitably distracted and the Oba-san ripping into her own servant. However, for the time being she would stay her hand. It had been quite interesting seeing Oniai-chan recover from a wound so quickly, and it would be best to file that information away. Perhaps she would have to cut his head off to make sure he was truly dead? She grimaced as she saw through the eyes of Berserker that his fight was not going well. Whoever this new servant with the blonde hair was. If her calculations were correct, then this was the mysterious assassin that Castor had alluded to when they had first met. They were good. Scarily good. This was the first time she had seen Berserker being so outclassed in a fight. If he would only use his noble phantasm. But wait. Ilia blinked, and then she blinked again. Well, if he was so averse to using his noble phantasm, then Ilia would just have to force his hand. She felt a twinge of regret as she remembered his warning, but in her mind the pros outweighed the cons. This was necessary for her to finish this battle with Assassin once and for all. She began to gather energy for her command spell, being bathed in ethereal red light. Castor approached the very edge of the bounded field that he knew Zoken had set up, and then he threw the 2 bodies that he had been carrying over into it, knowing it would have the old man come running. However, he would not be there when Zoken found the body of his grandson and the servant who was just coming to know his night was completed. It was time to go back to the temple and lick the wounds that he had acquired over the night. Assassin dodged another one of his son's punches and lashed out with another kick that sent Naruto skidding back. His son had lost Sage Mode a while ago and was definitely beginning to run on fumes. He wondered how much longer it would be before Naruto's body just gave out on him. He had extended Sage Mode to last ever since the battle started, and that was damn near half an hour ago. It wasn't meant to be used in combat for that period of time, and Naruto's body, servant or not, was probably feeling pretty abused at the moment. I don't know how much more your body can take, Naruto.
You've had a good run, but I think it's time I end this. My trump card might be too much, but I think I'll make a special exception for you, so you can prepare. With that, Assassin began flying through hand signs. Naruto appeared to be on the verge of once more rushing him, but then something happened. He froze for a moment, and then a look of fear washed over his face.
Iliaheim, what have you done?
Berserker was tired. He knew that, he was pretty sure Minato knew it too.
It was only a matter of time before he was done for, and Minato had been kicking him around all night. It hadn't been a pleasant feeling, but it looked like this was pretty much his limit. It might be time to actually take his dad's offer of retreat. He had a good run, and with this he would be able to be better prepared for the next fight with his father. It was half the reason he rushed to attack in the first place. However, now was not the time to be picky about never giving up. He would just be making a tactical retreat is all. He would kick his dad's ass another day. Unfortunately for him, it seemed that his little master wanted to finish this business now. His eyes widened as he felt a command spell overtake his senses. No way, she didn't. That little master that he had joked with had just decided to ignore all his warnings. He said the first thing that came to mind as fear coursed through his veins. Iliaheim, what have you done? And then his whole world turned red. Ilia dug into herself, releasing her trigger and tapping into the magic that was her bond to Berserker. It was time to really unleash the namesake of her servant upon the world, and this assassin seemed like the best candidate for the job. By order of my command spell, Berserker.
Use your noble phantasm. She watched with some satisfaction as Oniai-chan looked over to her curiously, as did the other two servants.
Her voice had rang clear enough for them to hear her command. That was when everyone in the school felt the power of hatred and malice slam down upon them.
Ilia almost couldn't breathe. What was this?
She tried to reach out and control her servant in his maddened state, but cried out in pain as she was forcibly rejected.
That madness, no one could survive something like that. Not even a servant. What the hell kind of legend did her servant have? Suddenly a roar echoed throughout the school. She was almost certain that that roar had reverberated throughout the city.
For the first time since her decision, Ilia thought she may have made a mistake. Whatever was causing the unrelenting presence of malice and hate was connected to that roar.
There was no way to control it.
Naruto had warned her in the beginning not to force the noble phantasm, but she hadn't listened.
She hadn't listened.
Assassin paused as he watched his son mutter something under his breath, but his curiosity turned to alarm as he saw the vile red chakra begin to pour out of his son's pores. Naruto was awash in an ethereal red glow, and Assassin could only watch in horror as one tail began to form, then two, then a third, the fourth was beginning to form as well, and Assassin knew he had to act fast. The stakes had just gotten so much higher, and now instead of showing his son his trump card because he wanted Naruto to be ready for next time, he was now going to reveal his hand out of need. The fourth tail rapidly formed and his son disappeared into the swirling mass of hate and malice, and in his place stood what looked like a miniature Kyuubi. However, it wasn't stopping there as another tail formed and then another. Now a skeleton had grown over the form and the beast roared.
Assassin felt a shiver go down his spine at that roar.
It was unnatural, a bijou roar in the throes of madness. It seemed that his son's little master had decided to open Pandora's box, and it was now up to Assassin to somehow stop this beast from getting out into the world. That was fine, he had done it before, and he could do it again. He kept the hand signs flowing, reaching deep within himself into his very essence. He had closed his eyes, but when he opened them they were glowing blue with power. It was time to show the Kyuubi why he should be feared, especially as a servant in this war. When Assassin had gone down into his essence, he had brought it back to the surface. It was time now to expand that essence. He would bring the Kyuubi to a place where they could battle in peace. He would only be able to hold it for maybe 5 minutes, possibly less, but hopefully he would be able to subdue Naruto and bring him back from the brink. He closed his eyes again, just to make sure he felt everything ready as his hands landed on the last hand sign. Assassin's eyes flashed open and a spiral of blue fire surrounded him. That spiral then grew, encompassing the roof and the Kyuubi as well, and where the blue fire touched, the landscape changed. Gone was the rooftop of a school, and in its place there now was a field with a pale moon, the field where he had first fought the masked man, well, so long ago, but unlike before, the field was covered in his tri-pronged kunai. He and Kyubi were standing in the center of it all. Assassin gazed at the monster across from him and knew that this had to be done.
Kurama, Naruto, welcome to my reality marble, the graveyard of kunai.
That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfiction.
Looking forward to having you on board again.